I was exploring a vast, desolate stretch of the desert in New Mexico last year with a group of friends. We were set up in a primitive area, 6 of us in our early 20s, plus my older brother, who's in his late 40s, and has spent half his life doing deep country survey work. We were miles from the nearest paved road, camped out near a series of ancient crumbling red rock canyons. The first 2 nights were perfect too. Bone-dry air, incredible stars, and total isolation. But on the 3rd night, the desert started to feel crowded. It was just after midnight. I had already crawled into my sleeping bag and was sort of drifting off. A few of the guys were still huddled around the dying embers of the fire, while the others had walked about 200 yards down a sandy wash to facilities, a small solar-powered concrete block with a single light that acted like a beacon in the pitch-black basin. From our tents, the lone yellow bulb looked like a tiny star hovering on the horizon, and according to my friends, they were in the middle of some mindless banter, joking about whose turn it was to cook breakfast in the morning or whatever. The sound of their voices was carrying easily in the thin, silent air too, when a man stepped out of the darkness and into the light of the concrete block. They said that he looked like he was in his late 30s, wearing a heavy oil-tanned duster and thick work boots. He didn't look like a backpacker. He had no gear, no water bottle, and he wasn't wearing a headlamp or anything. He didn't even acknowledge their presence, in fact. He just walked to the metal sink, turned the tap on full blast, and stared into the mirror for a bit. My friend said that his reflection didn't look like he was checking his face, though. It looked like he was staring through the glass at something miles behind him. He didn't use any soap, didn't wash his hands, he just let the water run for a solid 2 minutes in total silence while my friends just stood there, sort of frozen. Finally, he turned the tap off and walked back out into the blackness of the wash. That was unsettling enough, but the real fear set in 30 seconds later. They suddenly realized that they couldn't hear the sound of his boots on the hard-packed sand anymore, and the footsteps hadn't faded away. They had stopped right outside of the thin concrete wall. Then the sound changed. It became a slow, deliberate scraping sound, which meant that he was dragging something, a stick or a stone, along the exterior of the building, circling it in a slow, rhythmic loop. They didn't wait for a second pass. They grabbed their stuff and bolted back toward the campfire, moving with a frantic, uncoordinated speed. I was then startled awake by the sound of them crashing through the brush, their voices hushed and overlapping as they were trying to tell my brother what they had seen. They were genuinely shaken too, their flashlights darting around the perimeter of our camp. Then, my brother, who had been sitting perfectly still, reached out and grabbed the arm of the guy nearest him and said, "Quiet. He's already here," he whispered. I unzipped the mesh of my tent and looked where my brother was pointing. About 30 feet away, standing just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, was a silhouette. The man was standing behind a tall, twisted juniper tree nearby. He wasn't hiding, he was peering around the trunk, his body tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle. He had followed them through the 200 yards of trackless sand and scrub in total darkness, and he had done so completely quietly, so that none of them had even heard him behind them. My brother stood up and clicked on a high-lumen tactical floodlight, bathing the tree in a blinding white glare. The man didn't even flinch. He didn't squint or raise a hand to block the light. He just stood there, his eyes reflecting the beam with a strange flat intensity. My brother, in his surveyor voice, the one that doesn't leave room for argument, told him that he was trespassing on an occupied site and needed to get lost quickly. The man waited a long time before responding, and when he did, his voice was strange, thin and dry, like wind over dead grass. He said, "I like the sound of the laughing. It's been a long time since I heard that specific pitch." The way that he said specific pitch, that made my skin crawl. This isn't the way that normal people talk about a joke. It sounded more like a way a scientist might talk about a frequency or something. which meant that he wasn't really interested in conversation. My brother, though, he didn't engage. He just repeated the order to leave and kept the light pinned on the man's chest. The stranger nodded slowly, backed away 3 steps, and then did something that none of us could explain. He didn't turn back toward the wash or the road or anything. He turned toward the vertical face of the canyon wall, a sheer 60-foot drop of crumbling sandstone, and began to move along the base of it into the shadows where the light couldn't reach anymore. Again, too, as soon as he was out of eyesight, we could no longer hear him walking or moving or anything. We stayed up the rest of the night with the floodlights on that night. Every now and then, too, we could hear the sound of small rocks tumbling down the canyon side every 20 minutes or so, circling us from above, which meant that he was moving across the high ledges in the dark, watching us from the rim. We didn't wait for the sun to fully rise. We were packed and the engines were turning over by 4 in the morning, and as we drove along the long, jarring track out to the highway, I looked back at the canyon rim. The sun was just starting to bleed over the edge now, and I couldn't see anything. We reported it to the local sheriff's office 2 hours later. They told us that drifters, that they occasionally hole up in the caves in that sector, but they'd never heard of anyone following a group back to camp like that. They promised to send a patrol car out to check it out, but we all knew that in 1,000 square miles of desert, that man was now long gone. So my aunt lived in a dying steel town in Ohio back in the early 2010s. The economy, it had completely bottomed out, and she made ends meet by doing mobile pet grooming and stuff like that. Mostly basic washes and clips for people who just couldn't travel to a proper shop. She didn't have a professional van or anything. She just carried her shears, shampoos, and towels in a heavy rolling suitcase and worked out of people's kitchens. It was right after a massive storm that paralyzed the county, and half the town was without power now. Her work had been non-existent for a week, and the stress of her overdue heating bill was starting to feel like a physical weight. When a call came in from a neighborhood on the outer rim, she took it without asking many questions. She pulled up to a house that looked like a hollowed-out shell, really. The grey paint was curling off the wood like dead skin, and the porch was sagging dangerously. There was a large matted dog tied to a rusted iron post out front. That was her supposed client. She knocked and the door didn't just open. It creaked inward as if the house was exhaling. A man stood there. She said that he was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, and he was completely shirtless, despite the freezing draft that evening. He didn't have a dog owner's hello ready, he just stared at her with eyes that were completely dilated, 2 black pits in a pale, sweating face. She started her pitch, her voice shaking slightly from the cold, talking about the price for a full clip. He didn't look at the dog once. He didn't even look at her face. He was looking at her rolling suitcase, his eyes tracking the movement of her hand on the handle. He stepped back into the pitch-black hallway and said, "The water's hot in the back. Bring your bags inside where it's warm. The dog doesn't like the cold." Usually, she'd negotiate at the door or bring the dog to the porch, but the wind was biting and she was thinking about the $50 that she needed for her gas bill. She stepped onto the threshold, her boot landing on the warped linoleum floor. But she stopped before her second foot hit the floorboards. The house was unnervingly silent, yet she heard a faint sort of metallic snick from behind the heavy front door, the sound of a thumb turning a deadbolt being slowly primed. The angle of the hallway changed as her eyes adjusted to the dark. She looked past the giant man and saw a second person sitting on a milk crate in the shadows of the kitchen. He wasn't moving. He was holding a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a pair of industrial metal shears. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the man's back, waiting for a signal, it seemed. The kitchen table was littered with small, jagged shards of glass and blue plastic baggies. the unmistakable debris of a localized cook that had clearly gone wrong due to the power outage. The man at the door started to lean his shoulder into the frame, his hand gripping the handle to pull the door shut behind her. My aunt is a very small woman, but she spent 20 years handling aggressive, unpredictable animals, and she didn't scream, and she didn't try to pull away. She knew that any sudden movement would trigger the snap that she could feel was now coming. Instead, she just reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen until it lit up his face. "Oh, hang on," she said, her voice perfectly level, almost bored. "That's my husband. He's idling at the end of the driveway because the heater in his truck is acting up. He's asking if I need him to bring the heavy-duty clippers in now, or if I'm just going to do a quick consultation." She looked the giant man dead in the eyes and smiled, a professional, I'm not worth the trouble smile that she used on stray pit bulls from time to time. "I'll just go and tell him to park and come up. It'll be easier with the two of us to hold the dog, right?" The man didn't move for a long, agonizing heartbeat. He looked at the phone, then at the guy in the kitchen, then back at the dark driveway behind her. The calculation was visible in his eyes. Finally, he just spat on the floor and stepped back, his posture deflating into a slouch. "Forget it," he grunted. "Dog's fine. We don't need you." She didn't run. She turned around with practiced calm, walked back to her car, loaded her suitcase into the trunk with steady hands, and got behind the wheel. She drove 3 miles to the nearest open gas station before she finally lost her lunch in the parking lot. Now, the thing that stays with me is what she told me later. You see, she knew that the second that she saw the guy in the kitchen, that she was in a trap house for sure. But her brain had actually tried to argue with her survival instinct, whispering, "But you really need that money." It's truly terrifying how easily our sense of danger can be muffled by the noise of basic necessity like that. My aunt still does mobile work, but she never crosses a threshold now unless she can see a clear path back to the street, and she never goes in without at least someone knowing her exact coordinates. This happened years ago when I was living in a town called Oakhaven, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia. I was renting an old 2-story farmhouse that sat at the very end of a winding dirt track, miles away from the nearest neighbor. During the day, the property was beautiful in a sort of rugged, overgrown way, but when the sun dipped behind the jagged ridgeline there, the atmosphere definitely shifted. The trees, mostly ancient oaks and hemlocks I think, seemed to lean in a bit closer, and the mountain quiet really set in. It's a silence that you have to really get used to being out there, only ever really broken by, like, the occasional scream of a bobcat or the rustle of the wind through the hollows. Because the house was so old, the heating was very temperamental there, and the master bedroom on the second floor had a catastrophic pipe burst in the middle of a cold snap. The landlord, a man who lived 3 towns over and clearly didn't want to make the drive, sent out one of those sort of luxury portable restroom trailers. It was nicer than the ones at the festivals. A flushing toilet, a small sink and its own internal light, but it had to be leveled on a flat patch of gravel about 20 yards away from the back porch, right at the edge of the tree line. For the first few nights, it was a cold walk too, let me tell you. I'd throw on a heavy coat, grab my high-illuminal tactical flashlight, and I would make the trek. And it was on the 4th night that things changed. It was around 1:15 in the morning, and a thick, low-lying fog had rolled down from the ridges, turning the backyard into a grey soup. My flashlight beam was useless now, reflecting off the mist like a solid wall, and I made it into the trailer, locked the door, and for a moment I actually enjoyed the warmth of the small space. But then I heard something. It wasn't a branch, it sounded like somebody had slapped the side of the trailer with an open palm. I sat perfectly still, my heart going absolutely crazy. I waited for a second hit, but instead I heard the sound of like scraping fingernails. It started at the back of the trailer and began to drag slowly, agonizingly slowly in fact, along the exterior wall toward the door. I then whispered, "Hello?" half hoping that it was a neighbor or maybe a hiker who had gotten lost in the fog. There was no verbal response though. Instead, the trailer began to rock gently. Let me reassure you too that this was not the wind. It was intentional swaying, as if something very large and very strong was pushing the structure. Then the voices started. It wasn't the low murmuring that you hear in most stories. These voices were weird. I heard the sound of like laughter, but almost like a hyena's laughter. Then I heard from the distance a man's voice, but it was so deep that it couldn't really have been a man's voice. It wasn't speaking in English, but it definitely sounded like a language. It was a series of sounds too, guttural and really deep, clicking sounds too that rose and sort of fell in pitch. I stayed frozen in that trailer for what felt like 3 hours, I would say. Every time that I reached for the door handle, that scratching would move directly onto the door, as if the thing outside knew when I was moving my hand. Finally, as the sun rose, the rocking stopped, and I heard the sound of like something moving outside, heavy and wet, and some sort of grunting noises, moving away from the trailer and into the dense brush of the tree line. I waited another 20 minutes at least before I just literally opened the door and sprinted for the house. I didn't look back, and I slammed the back door, locked every deadbolt that I could find, and pushed the kitchen table against the frame. I stayed there all day like that as well and missed work, and the next morning I went out to the trailer with a heavy-duty crowbar in my hand, fully expecting to find footprints or tool marks from a prankster or something, but what I found was weird. There were these absolutely enormous footprints, 3 of them, spaced about, 4 feet apart, maybe larger, with like a drag mark that seemed to be circling the entire unit. On the metal side of the trailer, right where I had heard the scratching, the paint had been scraped away in these long vertical lines too. But the scratches, they didn't stop at the roof line. They continued up onto the roof itself. Whatever had been out there was standing on the ground, and it seemed to have been draped over the top of the trailer, reaching down the sides almost, which meant that whatever this thing was, it was absolutely enormous. Maybe 9 feet tall, I would say. I called the landlord that afternoon, and I told him that I was moving out. I didn't care about the deposit or anything. He genuinely didn't even sound surprised, which was weird. He just asked, "Did you hear the birds or the voices?" I didn't know what that meant, but when I told him that I heard some voices and I was out there in the trailer and all that, he went quiet for a long time and then just said, "Don't go back for your things after dark. I'll have them moved to the curb for you by noon." I now live in a city, and people complain about the traffic and the sirens here, but genuinely after that, I love hearing those noises. It's the mountain quiet that actually scares me the most now. I was trekking through a remote stretch of the High Sierra in California with a close friend about a year ago. We're both seasoned hikers, so when our intended trailhead camp was overcrowded on a random Wednesday in October, we didn't panic at first. We just pushed another 3 miles up a decommissioned fire road to a flat clearing that we'd seen on a map. The moment that we dropped our packs, the atmosphere felt thin, and I don't mean the altitude. It felt like the air had been sort of pressurized or something. While my friend started clearing a spot for the stove, though, I wandered toward a cluster of some bushes at the edge of the clearing. Tucked into the red bark of one of the branches was a bright yellow silk ribbon tied in a complex decorative knot. It looked brand new, no sun bleaching, no frayed edges, and it sat there like a warning marker in the middle of nowhere. Our dog, a Belgian Malinois, who usually sleeps through anything, was acting completely out of character. She wouldn't sit. She kept performing a tight, frantic circle around our legs, her eyes fixed on a specific dark hollow between two massive boulders. She wasn't barking or snapping or anything. She was almost vibrating, a low-frequency shiver that I could feel through my boots when she brushed past me. By the time that the sun dipped below the peaks, that low-level unease had spiked into a primal biological scream to leave. I felt a weight on my shoulders, a sensation of being scrutinized by something with an immense amount of focus. And then, the forest just died. No crickets, no rustling needles, not even the sound of the creek that we knew was only a few hundred yards away. It was like a vacuum. My friend, who usually laughs off my vibes, looked at me though and whispered, "We're not staying here, man. Pack the tent back into the bags now." I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead all of a sudden, and I was staring at that dark gap between the boulders, waiting for something to emerge. My friend, he didn't even wait for me to help. He just started shoving loose gear into the trunk of the SUV, and when we finally managed to hoist the dog into the back seat, she was panting so hard that her tongue was turning purple, but she still wouldn't take her eyes off of that clearing. As we were bouncing back down the fire road, my friend, who is a very grounded, sort of no-nonsense person, was literally white-knuckling the steering wheel. He kept checking the side mirrors, and about a mile away from the site, he finally spoke. He told me that while I was frozen near the boulders, he looked up at the ridge and apparently he saw a sort of lanky, charcoal-colored shape that looked like a man but with really long limbs. He said that it didn't have any clothes or hair and it was moving in a strange horizontal crawl along the rocks, keeping pace with us until we hit the main pavement. I personally didn't see it, but I felt the departure of the pressure the second that we crossed the cattle guard at the park boundary. Now, I've hiked all over the Sierras, and I've seen bears, mountain lions, and plenty of weird people, but I have never felt that specific predatory silence before or since then. I even went back a few months ago during a hike, a day hike this time, to see if I could find that yellow ribbon. The bush was now gone as well. Not dead or cut, but just completely uprooted and missing, leaving nothing but a shallow, clean hole in the dirt where I guess it used to be. I don't plan on being in that zip code after sunset ever again, let me tell you. But has anyone else encountered markers like ribbons or knots in places where none should be? It felt less like a memorial and, I don't know, maybe more like a boundary line. This happened a few months ago while I was driving back to Portland after visiting some family in Central Oregon. It's the kind of interaction that feels entirely mundane on paper, I guess, but in person, it left me with a metallic taste in my mouth that I haven't been able to shake since then. I had stopped at a small sun-bleached roadside plaza. It was a single convenience store attached to a DIY car wash, one of those places where the asphalt is cracked and the wind just sort of circulates dust everywhere. I've pulled in there a dozen times for a coffee or a quick rinse of the windshield. The parking layout? It's a nightmare. 2 tight rows of stalls facing each other with barely enough room to swing a door open. But I went inside anyway, grabbed a bottle of water, and was back at the door in less than 3 minutes. When I stepped out, I was trapped though. Someone had ditched a beat-up sedan directly across the lane, parallel to the rows, blocking 3 of us in. I stood there for a second, hands on my hips, waiting for a driver to emerge, but nothing. I went back inside, and the clerk did a sort of half-hearted sweep of the aisles, but no one claimed the car. I walked back out to my vehicle and just sort of stood there, leaning against the fender. After a moment, a voice behind me said, "Rough spot to get pinned in, isn't it?" I turned around. A guy was standing a few feet away, leaning against a pillar. He was in his early 30s, wearing a faded baseball cap and a heavy canvas work jacket. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring intently at the license plate of the car blocking us. He seemed focused in a way that felt heavy, like he was solving a complex equation in his head. Before I could even agree with him, he looked up and said, "You heading back to..." and then my neighborhood. He named the exact specific suburb where I live even. It's not a major district too. I mean, it's tiny, a quiet pocket of the city that most people just call by the general name. My stomach did a bit of a slow, cold flip upon hearing that. My car doesn't have any local stickers or anything, and I haven't lived in that area long. I looked at him properly then, and my brain did that terrifying shutter click of recognition. When I was about 12 or 13, there was a man that I used to see constantly on my walk home from school. He was never in a car, he was always just there, standing at the bus stop, sitting on a park bench, or walking 20 paces behind me for 3 blocks. He never spoke to me, but he had this specific way of watching. Not a glance, but a sort of fixated stare, like he was memorizing the way that I walked. I had completely forgotten about him for like a decade at this point. But looking at this guy in a parking lot, I saw the exact same set to his shoulders and the same unblinking focus in his eyes that I recognized. It was like seeing a photograph of the guy, but aged 20 years later. Yeah, I said, my voice sounding thin. I live there. Do I know you? He didn't answer. He just nodded. Right then, too, the owner of the blocking car finally shuffled out of the shop, an older guy who looked totally oblivious. The younger guy immediately stepped toward him. He wasn't aggressive or anything, but his tone was incredibly precise. He started listing off the exact time the older man had parked and how many people he'd inconvenienced, citing it a bit like a police report. As the older man apologized and climbed into his car, I noticed the younger guy wasn't even watching him anymore. He seemed to be watching me through the reflection in my own side mirror. He was checking to see if I was still looking at him, I think. Once the lane was clear, the guy gave a short, dry laugh. Some people just don't have a sense of their surroundings, he said. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and added, "Watch out for the construction on the bridge tonight. See you around." He got into a truck 3 stalls down, one that I realized had been there when I first arrived, and drove off. Now, the logistics of all of that is weird, right? I was inside that store for maybe a minute and a half, I would say, and in that tiny window, a car happened to block me in, and he happened to be standing right there to witness it. But get this, there was a major accident on the bridge that night, and the news hadn't even reported the lane closures yet when I was at the gas station 2 hours away. I really don't know how that's even possible. I haven't seen him since then, but man, do I keep checking over my shoulders at night. I don't think it was a coincidence, and I think that some people spend their entire lives collecting others, and I just happened to run into my collector in a dusty parking lot in the middle of nowhere. I really don't know what to make of any of this, so if you guys have any theories as to who this guy is and what he wants, well, please do share. This happened last year while I was backpacking through a remote coastal region of northern Vietnam, near the border. I hadn't been back to that part of the world since I was a kid, and I wanted to see the rugged landscapes far away from the tourist hubs. My travel partner and I, we decided to hike out toward a peninsula overlooking the Gulf of Tonkin. It's a beautiful, desolate area, mostly limestone cliffs and dense thickets, with a few crumbling relics from the various conflicts that have swept through that region. We found ourselves on a disused service track that wound up a steep ridge. At the summit, there was a massive, brutalist concrete block of a building. It looked like a giant bunker or maybe a radio relay station that had been left to rot. There was no glass in the narrow window slits. The rebar was rusting out of the corners, and a heavy iron gate was hanging off of one hinge, held shut by a single rusted chain. There were some faded yellow characters stenciled on the wall, but neither of us could quite translate the dialect. It just looked like an empty place, the kind of ruin that nature was slowly reclaiming over time. Instead of the gate, though, we found a breach in the perimeter fence where the hill had subsided. We scrambled through and entered the lower level. The interior was unnervingly sterile. Most abandoned buildings are full of graffiti, right? Broken bottles or maybe some bird nests. This place, though, was spotless. The floors were swept, the air didn't smell like dust. In fact, it smelled like ozone and industrial cleaner. There were pale rectangles on the walls where equipment had clearly been mounted and recently removed. We climbed a set of service stairs to an observation deck that looked straight out over the water. I then pulled out my GoPro to get some panoramic shots of the coastline, thinking that this was the highlight of the trip. I was mid-sentence, too, describing the view when the silence was suddenly shattered. We hadn't heard a single footstep on the concrete the whole time that we were in there, but suddenly there were 4 men standing in the doorway behind us. They weren't wearing traditional military camouflage. They were in dark navy tactical gear, with no patches, no flags, and no name tags. They didn't have rifles out, but they did have sidearms, and that sort of specific coiled energy of people who are trained to react to things like this. I froze. My friend dropped his water bottle, and the sound of it hitting the floor felt like a grenade going off. One of the men, shorter than the others but with a face that looked like it was carved from mahogany, stepped forward. He spoke in a very clipped sort of formal English. No hello and no pleasantries. "This facility is under active observation," he said. "You've bypassed a restricted perimeter." I started stammering, explaining that we were just hikers and we thought the place was a historic ruin. I showed him my backpack and my trail map, trying to look as harmless as possible. He didn't care about the map, though. He pointed at the GoPro in my hand. "The memory card," he said. "Hand it over, now." It wasn't a request. I popped the card out and I handed it to him. He didn't even look at it, though. He just dropped it into what looked like a lead-lined pouch on his belt. Then he started asking very specific questions. How we had found the track, if we had seen any vehicles on the way up, and exactly how many minutes that we had been inside the structure. The most unsettling part was the professionalism, though. There was no anger, no shouting. It was like we were a minor glitch in a system that they were running. He explained then, in a very detached way, that this site was being used for coastal monitoring and strategic acoustics, I think he said, and that our presence had triggered a silent alarm miles away, apparently. They escorted us out, but not through the hole in the fence. They led us through a hidden interior door that opened into a pristine modern garage bay that we hadn't even noticed. Inside were 2 matte black SUVs with their engines idling. They watched us walk all the way back down the ridge. They didn't move until we were nearly a mile away, just 4 dark silhouettes standing on the top of a concrete block, watching us through binoculars, I think. We didn't talk until we reached the main village. The realization that we had been monitored by a group that didn't even officially exist on that map was honestly absolutely terrifying to me at the time, especially because we were miles away from anywhere called home. We had spent an hour thinking that we were exploring a dead ruin, while in reality we were standing in the middle of a live unmarked operation, and it could have gone very differently. I've stayed away from abandoned buildings ever since then too. I think I realized then that just because a place looks dead doesn't mean that it actually is. This happened earlier this year when me and my partner, we were flying out of Heathrow Airport after a short trip. The flight was late, whole place was packed, and everything felt kind of off because there had been delays all day. We got in line for security though, and it barely moved. Like one of those lines where you just sort of stand there for 20 minutes and maybe go forward like 2 steps. Normally, I don't pay attention to anyone around me too. Airports are just noise most of the time anyway, right? But after a bit, I noticed something weird. Not obvious at first, but just small stuff. Someone behind me kept getting really close, like closer than what you'd expect even in a crowded line. I figured that it was just people being impatient, but then I felt something brush against my bag. Not a bump, but more like a deliberate touch. I shifted forward a bit to create space. Didn't think too much of it. But a minute later, it happened again. At that point, I turned slightly, not fully, but just enough to get a look without making it obvious that I was reacting. There was a guy and a woman behind me. The guy was standing almost directly behind her, like too close, and one of his hands was resting on the handle of her suitcase, the other kind of at her back, I would say. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead, and I turned back around but kept it in mind. Something felt off, but I couldn't really say what it was yet. Then it happened again, but this time it was way clearer. I felt a quick tug on the strap of my backpack, like somebody was trying to get my attention without being seen. That's when I turned properly. The guy immediately looked at me like he was checking my reaction. I didn't say anything, just held eye contact for a second too long. Then I looked at the woman. She had this look that's hard to explain unless you've seen it before. Not crying and not panicking, but just tense, like she was trying to act normal but couldn't quite pull it off. I didn't say anything right then, just turned back around and started thinking. We were still a decent distance from the front, but I could see staff checking boarding passes before security. That gave me a bit of time to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to confront the guy directly, no idea how he would react, and we were boxed in by people, so I waited. As the line moved, I slowed down slightly on purpose so that they would stay behind me. My partner noticed something was up and asked quietly what I was doing. I just said, "Something feels off," and I left it at that. When we got closer to the checkpoint where they checked tickets, I stepped slightly to the side and told one of the staff that I thought that the woman behind me might not be okay. I didn't make a big deal about it, just sort of said it quietly. They nodded like they heard that kind of thing before and told me to just keep moving. A few minutes later, things started to separate. The guy was stopped before entering the next section, and I didn't hear exactly what was said, but it sounded like he didn't have the right boarding pass or something didn't match up. He tried to argue a bit, but they weren't letting him through. The woman kept moving forward with the line, and I glanced back once and saw them talking. He looked annoyed more than anything, and she didn't really react. At that point, I still didn't know if I had read the situation right or not, but once we got through the trays and the bag check area, I saw her again, a couple of people behind me. I didn't want to make a scene, so I just sort of typed something quickly on my phone, "Are you okay?" And when she got close enough, I turned slightly and showed her the screen. She looked at it for maybe a second, then said out loud, normal tone, "Yeah, I'm good." But then she leaned a bit closer like she was adjusting her bag and said quietly, "Thank you." And that was it. No long explanation, nothing dramatic, just that. When we got to the scanners, we ended up in a different lane, and I didn't see her again after that. I did ask one of the security staff once I got through if everything was okay back there. They just said that they were handling it, which didn't really tell me anything. The whole thing stuck with me, though, more than I expected. Not because I know exactly what was going on, I mean, I still don't, but because of just how subtle the whole thing was. If she hadn't have done that small thing to get my attention, I probably wouldn't have noticed anything at all. And if I'm being honest, I'm not even 100% sure that I handled it the right way. I just went with what seemed safest at the time. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that. The flight was normal, trip home was pretty uneventful, but yeah, it messed with me a bit for sure. I guess it was the realization of just how easy it was for something bad to be happening right in front of you, and it just sort of blends in with everything else. I was visiting family in rural Vermont last summer, staying in a cluster of old farmhouse buildings that had been in the family for nearly 80 years. It's a tight-knit spot, 5 small houses centered around a communal stone courtyard. Every evening, all the kids in the family, about 12 of us in total, would gather in my aunt's large sunroom to do our summer reading and school prep. It was a routine, same time every night, same circle of chairs, same low hum of voices. About 2 weeks into the trip, the younger cousins started whispering about the observers in the corner. At first, we told them to go back to their books. But then, kids who weren't even sitting near each other started pointing at the exact same spot on the far north wall, near an old upright piano. They described 2 figures, but they weren't ghosts in the way that you'd think. They couldn't see faces, arms, or legs. They just saw 2 pitch-black brimmed hats, like stiff rounded bowlers, hovering at adult height against the wallpaper. Personally, I didn't believe it as well, until the 3rd night. I was mid-sentence helping a cousin with a history chapter when I looked up, and there, positioned perfectly still against the floral print of the wall, were 2 dark voids. They looked like they had been cut out of the room with a pair of scissors almost. One was 6 feet up, the other slightly lower. They weren't misty or anything too, they were completely solid. What was weirder too was the timing. They only appeared the moment that we all opened our books and the room fell into that specific rhythmic drone of a dozen kids studying. If someone started a loud argument or jumped up to play, the shapes would instantly thin out and vanish. But as soon as we settled back into that work, they'd fade back into view, just watching the back of our heads. It became a silent part of our nightly routine and study in the end. We didn't even talk about it after a while. We just accepted that the hat men were part of the room. One night, my older brother got fed up with the vibe and threw a heavy dictionary toward the corner, though. We all expected it to thud against the wall. But instead, the book hit something solid about 2 feet in front of the wallpaper. It bounced, too, as if it had struck a person's chest, falling flat to the floor. The shapes didn't move, though. Didn't flinch and didn't leave. The adults, of course, thought that we were just fueling each other's imaginations. They checked the room for shadows and told us to stop being dramatic in the end. But then, at the end of the month, a construction crew came out to the courtyard. There was an old hand-dug well shaft that had been covered with rotting plywood for decades there, and the family finally paid to have it properly filled in with 10 tons of gravel and capped with a massive concrete slab. That night, we all sat down in the sunroom. We opened our books, we started the study session, and we waited. The corner stayed empty, though. We stayed there for 3 hours, but the hat men never materialized. They were gone the exact moment that well was sealed, it seemed. I still don't have a spiritual explanation for it, and I mean, it didn't feel like a haunting or anything. It felt like a glitch in the house that only happened when the water in that well was exposed and we were making a specific kind of noise, which I know is really weird to say, but honestly, that's just what I thought. We went back there this year, though, and the room is just a normal sunroom again, I guess. Still, though, none of us ever really sit with our backs to that north wall anymore because of, well, what we saw. So I don't usually share stuff like this, but this is one of those things that has really stuck with me because I still don't have a clear explanation for any of it. This happened mid-2023, when me and a friend, Jay, were driving back after being out most of the day. Nothing unusual, just a long drive, both tired, wanted to get home that night instead of staying over somewhere else, and it got late faster than we expected. By the time that we were on the highway heading inland, it was well past midnight. Not many cars around, just the occasional truck. About 40 or maybe 50 minutes outside of town, we passed a police vehicle parked on the shoulder with hazard lights on. One of the officers waved us down. Didn't think too much of it at first. I mean, it was probably just a random check. It happens. And they asked where we were heading, how long we'd been driving, that kind of thing. It was pretty standard stuff, but then it sort of dragged on longer than usual, I would say. Same questions repeated in slightly different ways. One of them asked if we had considered stopping somewhere for the night. I said no, that we were fine, and only about an hour left before we were home anyway. He then kind of paused, looked at the other officer, and then said something like, "Just be careful on this stretch. If you feel tired, pull over somewhere safe, alright?" Didn't sound like a warning about animals or road conditions or anything. More like he was choosing his words carefully and just sort of looking out for us, I guess. Anyway, they let us go and we kept driving. The road got quieter the further that we went. No street lights and just the headlights and whatever you could catch in the distance from time to time. About 20 minutes later, it started raining. Not light rain either, like proper heavy to the point where visibility dropped off a lot. So we pulled over at one of those rest areas, just a small gravel section with a bench and a bin. We sat there for a bit, engine off, waiting it out. And this is where things started to get a bit weird, but not in a really obvious way, I would say. So Jay got out of the car for a second, said that he needed to stretch a little bit. I stayed inside, scrolling my phone, and after maybe a minute, he got back in. We waited a bit longer, then decided to just keep going. And as we got back on the road, something felt off, but I just couldn't place it straight away. But then I realized that Jay wasn't talking. That's really not normal for him. I mean, even if he's tired, he'll still say something, but he was just sort of sitting there, facing forward. I asked him something simple, like if he wanted to stop for food when we got closer to town. He responded, but it was delayed, like half a second too long, and short answers. I just assumed that he was exhausted, but then I noticed something else too. His clothes were dry. He had stepped out into the heavy rain, you see, and I remember it clearly because I got wet just opening the door for a little bit. But his hoodie looked like it hadn't been touched. I even made a comment about it, like, "How are you not soaked?" He just said, "Didn't stay out long." Didn't really explain it, but I let it go. We kept driving, and maybe 10 minutes later we came up on some roadwork sections when a couple of workers were standing with a stop sign or a slow sign nearby. It was definitely a bit odd at that hour, but not impossible, so they flagged us down, and one of them walked up to my window and asked where we were heading. I told him, and then he looked at me properly and said, "You by yourself?" I kind of laughed and said, "Nah, my friend's here," and I pointed to the passenger seat. But when I turned my head, nobody was there. The seat was empty. The door was closed. No sign anyone had been there. I didn't even react straight away. It was like my brain just didn't process it. The worker asked again if I was okay, and I just sort of nodded and said, "Yeah, probably just tired." They waved me through, and I drove maybe another 2 minutes and pulled over again, this time properly shaken. I checked the car, back seat, boot, everything, but Jay was gone. I tried calling Jay, and he answered straight away, and the first thing that he said was, "Where did you go?" I asked what he meant. He then said that we stopped at the rest area, and I got back in the car and drove off while he was still outside. He thought that I was messing with him at first, but then I just didn't come back. He'd been trying to call me, but said that it wasn't going through apparently. according to him, that was about 20 to 25 minutes earlier. So, from his perspective, he just never got back into the vehicle. I didn't tell him what I thought had happened, just said that I must not have realized that he had gotten back in and I would come and get him. I turned around and I drove back. The whole way back, though, I kept checking the passenger seat without meaning to, just quick glances, but there was no one there. When I got back to the rest stop, he was standing under the shelter, properly soaked, and looked annoyed more than anything. He got in the car and yeah, this time he was actually wet, like you would expect. We didn't talk much after that, but about 10 minutes into driving again, the car started acting up a bit. Not fully breaking down, but just sort of struggling, I would say, like it was losing power on and off or something like that. At one point, Jay sort of half-jokingly said, "Feels like the car's heavier or something." I didn't respond to that. Eventually, thankfully, it sorted itself out, and we made it back without anything else really happening. Although I was stopped by the guy with the slow sign again, and he sort of joked about having somebody in the passenger seat this time, which Jay looked at me weird about that. Anyway, the next day I asked him again about the timing, just to be sure, and he was certain, said that I had just left him there. What I cannot explain, though, is the gap in between, because I know that I drove with somebody in that seat. I spoke to him, got responses, noticed things that didn't add up. But if he never got back into the car, then who or what was sitting there that whole time? I still drive that road sometimes, and nothing like that has ever happened again, but I don't stop in that rest area anymore either. I lived in a sprawling modern house in the Texas Hill Country for a few years during high school. It was one of those massive custom-built estates on a huge limestone lot, backing onto a deep, jagged ravine filled with cedar trees and ancient oaks that had been there, like, forever. It looked like a luxury retreat during the day, all glass, steel, and white stone. But at night, the scale of it felt fundamentally sort of wrong. It was too quiet, and the layout had too many dead zones where the air felt like it was standing still, thick, and heavy, as if it were holding its breath almost. I stayed there often with my friend, though, Sarah. Her parents were high achievers who were rarely home, leaving us with this cavernous 5-bedroom house all to ourselves. The nuisance stuff started almost immediately, too, and it was so persistent that it became a bit of a chore. We'd be in the upstairs media room and hear the distinct heavy sound of the high-backed wooden dining chairs being dragged across the limestone tile in the kitchen downstairs. It was a loud grating screech, the sound of something heavy being moved without purpose. We would go down to go and check it out, but the chairs would always be perfectly tucked in. But the pantry door would be standing wide open, which was weird, swinging slightly on its hinges. The main event happened, though, over a long weekend in October. The weather, it had turned cold, and a dry, whistling wind was coming up through the ravine that day. We were in the kitchen making food at around 11. Her dog, a massive 120-pound Great Pyrenees named Bear, was sprawled out on the rug, and he was the kind of dog that didn't really move for anything. Usually, anyway. You had to sort of step over him like a piece of furniture, in fact. He was a steady guardian breed, and not prone to nerves, is what I'm getting at. Sarah was standing at the island, middle of a sentence, when she suddenly froze. She didn't look up, she just completely went rigid, her voice dropping suddenly to a whisper. "Did you just touch my shoulder?" I was 10 feet away by the fridge. My hands were full of drinks, too. I hadn't moved. I shook my head, a cold spike of adrenaline hitting my chest. Before I could answer, the room suddenly changed. Every single magnetic cabinet latch in the kitchen released at once. It sounded like a firing squad. 10 cabinet doors swung open in a perfect synchronized wave, revealing the dark interiors all at once. We didn't scream, we were just paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it all. Then, Bear stood up. He didn't bark, but he started a low vibrating growl, a sound so deep that I could feel it in my own teeth. His hackles were raised so high that he looked like a wolf, and he was staring at the empty air between the kitchen island and the pantry. His eyes were tracking something that was seemingly moving toward us, something that we couldn't see. "Upstairs now," Sarah hissed. We sat on her bed with every single light on, Bear pacing the length of the room, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom of the door. He was huffing, short, sharp breaths of pure stress it seemed. I was staring at her nightstand, trying to calm my breathing when I noticed her braided charging cable started to move. It was a 3-foot cord plugged into the wall, and it didn't slide off the table due to gravity or anything. It was being coiled. I watched, unable to find my voice, as the cable looped itself into a perfect tight circle on the wood, as if an invisible hand was meticulously tidying up the space. Then, all of a sudden, the touch lamp on her desk flared to life too. It didn't just turn on, it went to its highest setting instantly, a blinding artificial glare. We both jumped, and Sarah, acting on instinct, reached out to tap the base to turn it off. The second that her finger made contact with the metal, the lamp didn't just go dark, it literally imploded. The bulb didn't pop. What I mean is that the actual frosted glass shade of the lamp, hairline sort of fractured into 1,000 pieces and slumped onto the desk in a heap of dust and shards. Bear went absolutely berserk at this too. He started snapping at the air in the center of the room, his teeth clicking together with a terrifying force. He backed away toward the balcony door until he was trapped in the corner, letting out a yelp, a high-pitched, pathetic sound that I had never heard from a dog that size. Then, he just bolted. He hit the bedroom door with his shoulder so hard that the latch snapped. The wood splintered as the door flew open. He disappeared into the dark hallway, and we heard his heavy paws thundering down the stairs, followed by a violent metallic crash coming from the basement level. We ran after him, terrified that he was actually hurt. We found him in the laundry room, shivering behind the dryer, his eyes rolled back so far that you could see the whites. The heavy, industrial-sized washing machine, it had been shifted 3 feet out from the wall, effectively barricading the exit to the garage. It weighed hundreds of pounds, and there was no physical way that a dog, even Bear, could have nudged it that far. We didn't stay to move it back. We grabbed our keys, hiked the dog into the car, and drove to a 24-hour diner 10 miles away. We sat in a booth until the sun came up, none of us saying a single word. The aftermath was what actually broke my skepticism for good, too. A month later, he pulled up the cloud-based footage from their internal security system. He showed us a clip from the night that we left. In the footage, the kitchen is empty. The clock on the microwave reads 1:14, and then, one by one, the heavy dining chairs don't just move, they lift 6 inches off the tile floor and set themselves back down with a silent and heavy thud. Then, the pantry doors fly open with enough force that the handle punches a hole in the drywall. But the detail that ended the debate for me was something that her dad found in the original survey of the land. When they had cleared the lot 5 years prior to pour the foundation, the builders had uncovered a caved-in cellar from an 1800s homestead that hadn't been on any modern map. It was a deep, stone-lined hole, filled with rusted farm implements, old chains, and charred timber from a fire. Instead of clearing it out or reporting it, the developers had simply leveled it with a bulldozer, poured a massive 4-foot thick concrete slab over the top of it, and built the media room in the kitchen directly over those ruins. The house, it's still there. It's been sold 3 times in the last 5 years. Each time the listing comes up, the photos show a pristine, beautiful home with unobstructed views, but I can never look at those wide open floor plans without thinking about the things that are still trapped under the concrete there, trying to tidy up the cables seemingly and open the doors. I just want to say this up front that I'm certainly not someone who jumps to ghosts as an answer. I worked most of my life in IT, a pretty logic-based thinking, and I'm usually the guy to try to explain things away, not lean into them. But this is one thing that I've never really been able to put into a neat box. This happened back in 2008. We had just finished moving out of a place that we lived in for years. The house itself wasn't anything special. Single story, brick veneer, built maybe in the late 70s, I think, from what I could tell. We'd been there over a decade now. Nothing weird had ever stood out while we lived there. No noises, no strange incidents, nothing that made you uncomfortable. The move was very messy, though. The block had a narrow driveway and a bit of a slope there as well, so we couldn't get a proper moving truck in. So we ended up shifting everything over about 4 days using trailers and smaller loads, all that stuff. By the last day, the place was basically empty though, just a few things left to double check. My wife and kids were already settled at the new place, thankfully. I told her that I'd go back one last time, do a final sweep, and then drop the keys off at the agent in the local shopping center. And here is where it started getting a bit off. So we had 2 sets of keys to this place. I'd already handed mine in earlier in the week, so I took hers to get into the house. I get there, put the key in, and it just doesn't work. It goes into the lock fine, turns, but nothing actually disengages. There's no click and no resistance, nothing. It just sort of spins. Tried both locks on the door, and it was the same thing. I called my wife and I asked if she had any issues the day before when she locked up, and she said no, everything worked like normal. At that point, I figured that maybe something in the lock had jammed or maybe broken, so I drove to the agent, grabbed my original set, and I head back. This time the door opened straight away, no resistance and no issue. Same locks, same door, and same day. That was obviously a bit weird, but I pushed past it. Figured that maybe I'd misaligned the key or something stupid like that. Anyway, I went inside and started doing a proper check. Opened all the cupboards, checked under the sinks, behind the doors, that sort of thing. Standard stuff when you're handing a place over. Everything felt pretty normal, quiet, empty house kind of thing. And then I went into what used to be my office, a small room, a back corner of the house. We'd taken everything out except for a whiteboard that was mounted to the wall. I wasn't planning on removing it or anything, but there were still a few notes on it. Phone numbers, random reminders, nothing important, but I remember thinking that I should just wipe it clean before handing the place over. No real reason to it, I guess, but just habit, I suppose. So I walked over, used my hand to rub part of it off, and the second that I did that, it hit me. Not like a normal cold feeling, but it was instant, full body, like stepping into a freezer, but way sharper. My arms, chest, back, everything just dropped in temperature all at once, and it wasn't gradual by any means. At the same time as well, I heard something. It sounded like a woman crying, but not clearly, more like a low, drawn-out sort of sound. The strange part is that it didn't come from one direction. It wasn't like somebody in the next room or anything. It felt like it was just sort of there, everywhere, all around me at once. Mind you, there were no footsteps and no movement, just this really weird sound. I stopped immediately, didn't try to rationalize it in the moment. I just sort of stood there for maybe a second or two and then walked straight out of the room. Not running, but moving quickly enough that I didn't want to linger any longer. I got out of the house and I locked the door and I just left. The drive back to the new place was maybe 10 minutes away. I remember checking the rearview mirror more than usual, but thankfully nothing else happened. When I got home, My wife asked if I was okay right away. Apparently I looked a bit off. Pale, she said. I told her what happened, and even as I was explaining it, I could hear how it sounded. We didn't go back. The keys went straight to the agent the next day, and really that was it. For years after that too, and I mean years, probably close to a decade even, I had this really weird thing happen to me. I had the same dream on and off for ages. Not every night, but often enough to notice a pattern for sure. Every couple of weeks, or sometimes even more. The dream was always the same setup, the same house, the same layout, but the focus was always under the house, like the ground beneath it. In the dream, there was this very clear idea that something had happened there before the place was built. Not something vague, but something deliberate. Someone was hurt, buried, or covered up or something. I'd wake up every time at the same point, usually right when I was about to see something in the ground. A proper adrenaline wake-up too, heart going, sweating, jumping out of my skin and all that. And it never really changed. Same sequence every time. And look, I don't have any evidence to say that something actually happened there. Never checked any records, and I never followed up. Part of me didn't want to go digging into it, to be honest. Looking back, I still try to break it down logically. I mean, the lock issue could have just been a mechanical failure, or user error for sure. The cold sensation, well, maybe that was stress or some kind of physical response to an empty room. The sound could have been external noise carried oddly through an empty house, I suppose. The dreams, well, they could be my brain trying to process a stressful or unusual moment, I suppose. All of that is possible, but the timing of everything lining up the way that it did, all within a couple of minutes, is what I cannot really reconcile cleanly. I've never had anything like that happen before or since then, not in any other house and not anywhere else. So I just don't really have a conclusion to all of this. It's just one situation that didn't behave the way that I thought that it should have, I suppose. And there's no solid explanation that fully accounts for all of it. It was late autumn, just after a series of massive coastal storms had knocked out the power lines for 3 days. My mother was 19 at the time, sharing a basement apartment with her sister, Sarah, in an old Victorian house that had been converted into flats. The house was built on a steep hill, so the basement was partially subterranean, with thick stone walls that stayed damp no matter how high you turned the heat. Because the power was out, the only light in her bedroom was the grey, filtered moonlight coming through the small, high windows near the ceiling. My mother woke up at exactly 3 a.m. to a sound that she initially thought was a burst pipe in the wall. It was a thick, wet, sort of rhythmic thudding, like something heavy and saturated with water was being dropped onto the floor over and over again. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the center of the room. There, standing between their 2 twin beds, was a shape. It was nearly 7 feet tall, but it was incredibly thin, almost skeletal, and it didn't have a solid surface to it. She described it as looking like black, oily smoke that had been forced into a sort of human shape, constantly churning and rolling as if it was struggling to stay coherent. It didn't have a face, just a slight indentation where eyes should have been, absorbing what little moonlight was left. The noise changed the second that she made eye contact with it too. The thudding stopped, replaced by a sound that my mother says haunted her sleep for decades. She said that it sounded like a cacophony of reversed audio. It sounded like 20 people, men, women, and children, all talking at once, but every syllable was sort of flipped backward and played at double speed. It created a garbled, vibrating drone that made her ears ring and her head throb with a sudden blinding migraine. This thing didn't walk in a way that made sense, too. It drifted toward the foot of her bed with a heavy sort of metallic scraping sound. She said that it sounded like someone was dragging a massive sheet of rusted lead across the carpet. As it got closer, the temperature in the room plummeted. My mother said that she could even see her own breathing, frosting in the air in thick white plumes, even though the basement was usually the warmest part of the house. She pulled her feet up and curled into a ball, squeezing her eyes shut so hard that she even saw spots. She felt the weight of the entity pass by the end of her mattress. The bed frame actually groaned and tilted under the immense invisible pressure. And then, the backward voices suddenly cut to a dead, oppressive silence that felt louder than the noise. She laid there for 10 minutes, paralyzed by fear, the kind that tells your heart to stop beating so that nothing hears you. Finally, she heard a tiny, terrified sob from the other side of the room. "Did you see the smoke, man?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "It's standing in my closet now. I can hear it breathing. It sounds a bit like a vacuum." They didn't move until the first light of dawn hit the windows. When they finally summoned the courage to flip the light switch on, once the power was back on, they found perfectly circular damp patches on the carpet where the figure was once standing. The water, it didn't smell like the rain from outside. It smelled like stagnant pond water and old copper, and it left a faint sort of dark stain that never fully came out no matter how much they scrubbed it. In the weeks that followed, the house became a hot zone for activity too. The kitchen cabinets would be standing wide open every morning, even if they had been locked. The radio would scan through stations on its own, stopping only on the static between channels. The most chilling part happened when my grandfather visited to help them move out. He was sitting in the living room alone when he felt cold, thin fingers wrap around his throat, tightening just enough to leave faint, bruised imprints that lasted for days. He never did believe in ghosts, mind you, but he refused to step foot into that place ever again after that. They moved 3 times in the next 5 years, but whatever this thing was, it seemed to follow them. My mother heard the backward whispering coming from the baby monitor when I was an infant, and she'd find my toy blocks stacked in impossible, gravity-defying towers in the middle of the night, towers that always collapsed the second that she looked at them. To this day, my mother cannot handle glitchy audio. If a video stalls or a recording skips, she always leaves the room. She's convinced that whatever that thing was, that it wasn't the spirit of a person who had died or anything. She likes to call it something unrendered, a piece of another reality that slipped through a crack in the foundation and decided that her family was a reliable source of energy. The detail about the scraping metal and the backward voices has always been the worst part to me. It suggests that these things don't communicate with sound, I think. Whatever they are, they seem to communicate through the distortion of it, I suppose. It's almost as if they're trying to mimic our world, but can only produce the inverse of it or something. Anyway, has anyone else here ever experienced anything like this before? And if you have, then have you ever been able to get rid of it? And if you have been able to get rid of it, what did you do? So I grew up in a house that I honestly cannot explain. I can say with certainty that it was full of, well, something. There were moments that were subtle, cold drafts, whispers, objects moving slightly, but other times it was outright physical. Doors slamming, things thrown, scratches on walls, and even holes in pictures. Not just me too, but my siblings, friends, anyone who spent time there noticed it. I was somehow at the center of it all for whatever reason, though, and that's why I was terrified of the attic. The attic wasn't fancy, just a hatch in my sister's room, literally a ceiling panel that you could lift. But the space above was huge, dark and damp all the time. Walking in there during the day was bad enough. The floorboards creaked. You had to be careful of old nails sticking out everywhere. One Christmas, my mum and my sisters and I were moving stuff around in the attic, shifting boxes down the ladder. I was maybe 8 at the time, mostly watching. I didn't want to help, to be honest, but I was curious about what it looked like up there. At some point, no one was paying attention, so I climbed the ladder and I tried to peek inside. The gap from the ladder to the attic floor was bigger than I expected. I literally had to pull myself up and shimmy over the edge. I got in, though, and I took a look around. They had high ceilings, exposed beams, yellow insulin sticking out everywhere, boxes stacked in corners. Feeling bold, though, I turned to slide back down. The only problem was that I was too short. My legs just sort of dangled in the air and I couldn't actually reach the ladder again. So I called for my mum, but there was no answer. Suddenly, though, the air got really weird. Hot and really damp, but also in a really weird way, like it was sort of pressing down on me. My skin prickled, my chest tightened a bit, and I suddenly knew somehow that I just wasn't alone anymore. I looked to my left instinctually, and I saw it. Not a person, and not even a shape that made any sense. Just a mass of dark and thick smoke. Somehow, too, I just knew that it was looking at me. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, in fact, screaming for my mum to come and get me. The dark shape started moving closer. I tried to inch back toward the hatch, but my arms and legs froze. It felt alive, aware, and deliberate. Just as it was almost on me as well, my mum grabs around my arm and pulled me to the ladder. I was sobbing, panicked, shaking. I told her what I saw. She just hugged me and said that everything was okay and that I was safe. But it wasn't fine. That wasn't the only time, too. That feeling, the terror, the presence, came back over and over after that. Night terrors that left me sweating and screaming, a constant sense that something was nearby, watching and testing me. Nothing we did seemed to stop it. My siblings felt it too, though maybe not as intensely as I did. Over time, I started noticing some patterns too. Certain rooms would feel off at specific times. The attic was always the worst, but it wasn't the only place. Shadows would move across walls when there was nothing to cast them. Objects would shift places, sometimes small and sometimes large, and my dog would growl at empty corners, which was weird. Even now as an adult, I really cannot rationalize much of it. I know that I want to dismiss it, but I just cannot. There's just too much consistency, too many witnesses, and I can only describe it as a fight with something that wasn't human, something aware, intelligent, and I would say maybe even angry. I don't know if anyone else here has ever felt it. That pressure in a room, or the sense of a weight pressing on your chest, something watching you even when nothing is there. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it shaped how I saw the world for years. I avoid attics, I avoid dark corners, and I will never, ever be alone in a room at night again. So I was working as a short order cook at a small assisted living facility in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a few months back. While I was there, I downloaded this app called Spirit Lens, one of those ghost hunting apps that uses EVP, LiDAR mapping, and AR overlays to detect entities. Honestly, I didn't even really believe it. I mostly used it to kill time during my breaks, and nothing of note ever really happened too. Genuinely, it just felt like a bit of a gimmicky toy. Fast forward to last May, about a couple of weeks after Mother's Day, and I was at home in my apartment, a fairly cramped third-floor walk-up where I've made a lot of adjustments to make the space work for me and my two boys. My son, Ethan, was playing with my phone while I was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner. I assumed that he was watching YouTube or taking silly photos like he always does. But then, the apartment went deathly quiet. I heard Ethan's voice, very small and serious, say, "Hey Ghost, spin the balloon 3 times. I laughed from the kitchen, shaking my head. We had a stray helium balloon from Mother's Day that had lost just enough lift to sort of hover at shoulder height in the corner of the living room. It had been sitting there, completely motionless, for about 2 weeks now. I leaned around the door frame to make a bit of a joke, but the words literally died in my throat. The balloon was slowly and smoothly rotating to the right. One full turn, then 2, and then 3, and it stopped exactly where it had started. The air in the room suddenly felt like it had been sucked out. Ethan was beaming, looking at the phone screen, but I felt nauseous. I walked over and snatched the phone from him, trying to play it off as that's enough for today. I headed back to the kitchen to check the stove, my hand shaking so hard that I nearly dropped the ladle. Then the phone, which I had set on the counter, spoke. The EVP function didn't sound like a radio skip. It sounded like a gravelly, labored breath forming a single word. Son. I didn't move. I couldn't. I looked back into the living room where my other son, Leo, had joined Ethan. They were huddled together, and Ethan was frantically explaining what the ghost had done. That's when I saw the balloon. It wasn't in the corner anymore. It was drifting slowly, almost purposefully, toward the kitchen doorway. It moved behind me, hovering just inches from my shoulder, as if it were standing there watching me cook. Suddenly, the Govee strip lights that I used to light the entire main area flicked once and then died. The apartment went pitch black, and in the silence, the phone's EVP spoke again. But this time it wasn't a word. It was a sort of long wheezing sound that slowly turned into a mechanical, sort of distorted repetition of what I thought was stay. I instantly panicked. I lunged for the wall, my hand fumbling in the dark until I hit the overhead light switch. When the fluoro lights buzzed to life, the balloon was right in front of my face now, bouncing gently against my forehead. I didn't think. I just grabbed it and deflated it right there, the sound of the air escaping feeling like a scream in the quiet room. A few days later, I was talking to my neighbors in the hallway. I mentioned that the back bedroom, the one that my kids sleep in while I take the couch, always just felt a bit heavy. I told them that there was a specific corner by the window where the air felt 5 degrees colder and my kids were suddenly terrified to sleep. My neighbor looked at me with this hollow expression and then told me that apparently the previous tenant had been an elderly man with mobility issues who spent nearly all his time in that bedroom. He had passed away, apparently, in that exact spot by the window, and allegedly he had been there for a few days before anyone found him. What has stayed with me wasn't just the fact that he had died there, but it was that stay command that I heard. It felt like the app had given him a tool to try and keep us in that room with him. It wasn't just a random haunting as well. It felt like a desperate interaction from someone who had been alone for a long time. He seemed to use the balloon because it was the only thing light enough to move, and he used the app because it was the only thing that could give him a voice, I would say. I haven't opened the app since then. My apartment is thankfully quiet now, but I still leave the hallway light on, and I never, ever leave a balloon in that room. This was in 2020, not long after I moved back in with my parents. I'd had a really rough year before that, and I needed somewhere to sort of reset. So I drove across counties and I stayed with them for a while. The house itself wasn't old or run down, built early 2000s, pretty standard suburban place really. But from the first week, something about it just felt a bit off. Not in a dramatic way, but just this sort of constant low-level feeling like you were never really alone, even when you clearly were. I didn't say anything at first because I figured that it was just me being stressed out still. But one night, we all got home from dinner, me, my mum, my dad, and my younger sister. It was a pretty normal night too, and my sister went straight down the hallway to use the bathroom. Dad took the dog out the back, and that left me and my mum standing near the front of the house, right where the hallway meets the bedrooms. We were sort of mid-conversation, just talking about something random when it happened. Clear as anything, right behind my mother's shoulder, we both heard a quiet voice say, "Do they know that we're here?" Not loud, not echoing, but just right there, close enough that it sounded like somebody standing in between us. We both stopped talking instantly. I looked at her, she looked at me, and you could tell that we both heard the same thing. I asked her what she heard, and she repeated it almost word for word, no hesitation. That was when I started properly freaking out. I already wasn't in a very good headspace, so I went straight to the worst case thinking. There must be somebody in the house, maybe in the roof space or something. I got my dad to go and check the ceiling cavity. He didn't want to, but he went up anyway, and there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No disturbed insulation, no footprints, nothing moved. We checked the doors, the windows, everything, even outside for a bit, but there was nothing and it was all locked. Now, over the next couple of weeks, smaller things started happening too. Stuff that you could almost brush off individually, but together they certainly didn't feel right. One afternoon I was home alone, sitting in the living room, quiet house and no wind, when I heard the back door sensor go off. Just a little ding noise that we had installed, and I looked over and the back door was slowly opening by itself. There was no one there, no pressure change and no breeze. It just sort of opened halfway and then just stopped abruptly. I went over and tried to make it happen again, but I never could. Another time, late at night, I would hear low talking. Not words that I could ever really make out, but just the sound of two people, I think, having a conversation in another room. Every time that I went to go and check it, there was never anything there, though. It got to the point, too, where I started keeping the lights on, even during the day. Not because anything big was happening, but just because I constantly felt like I was being watched. Not imagined, and it was consistent and really creepy. My sister started avoiding the hallway at night as well. She didn't know about what happened with me and my mum at first, but she said that it felt like someone was standing there just waiting all the time. I didn't tell her what we heard until later, and when I did, she went quiet and said that made things worse. Nothing ever escalated beyond that. No objects thrown, no physical stuff, just the same pattern, sounds and doors and the feeling of like a presence or whatever. And eventually I moved out into my own place across town. And it stopped completely. No voices, no weird door stuff, no feeling of being watched, just normal silence again. Over the years I've thought back on all of this, and it's always that one sentence that has always stuck with me more than anything else. Do they know that we're here? So I was out late with a friend, Mark, who does urban photography in an old industrial district in Gary, Indiana, back in the autumn of 2023. It was a Tuesday night, maybe 11:45 I would say, and the district was a total ghost town. No traffic, no security patrols, just rows and rows of looming brick warehouses, rusted old loading docks, and the orange sort of sickly hum of a few flickering sodium vapor streetlights that seemed to make the shadows look deeper than they actually were. We had found a narrow alleyway that was covered in some really intricate, professional-looking graffiti, and we were set up with a tripod, taking long exposure shots. The silence was pretty quiet out there, that heavy, oppressive city silence where you can hear the ringing in your own ears, and every breath that you take, it feels like you're being broadcast for like blocks. About 15 minutes in, I got a really overwhelming feeling of just feeling sick or off or something. The atmosphere felt thick and pressured, and like it had just spiked out of nowhere, pressing against my eardrums. I sort of stopped mid-sentence and looked at Mark. Before I could even ask if he felt it, he whispered, "Don't move, just listen." We stood perfectly still, barely breathing. Then, from the far end of the alley, where it opened up into a fenced-off storage yard full of shipping containers, we heard a sharp, metallic sort of clang. It wasn't the sound of a cat or a gust of wind knocking over a bin. It sounded like someone had taken a heavy iron sledgehammer and swung it full force against the side of a hollow steel container. The vibration actually echoed off the brick walls around us. I literally jumped out of my skin. Mark, he tried to rationalize it. He's the kind of guy who needs a logical answer for basically everything. Probably just the metal contracting as it cools down, yeah? He muttered, though his hands were visibly shaking as he started fumbling with the tripod knobs. We were about halfway through packing the gear up, working in frantic, desperate silence, when the sound started. It wasn't a shout and it wasn't a whisper. It was the sound of a nursery rhyme. At least 6 or 7 voices, perfectly harmonized and eerily flat, sang the final line of Ring Around a Rosie. The voices, though, they didn't sound like children. They sounded like adults, both men and women, trying to imitate the high-pitched sing-song cadence of a kid, but without a shred of playfulness or joy. It was monotone, it was surgical, and the timing was terrifying. It didn't fade in from a distance or start with a breath or anything. It all started at full volume, as if they were all standing right there in the dark, inches away, holding their breath and waiting for an invisible conductor to give the signal. We couldn't agree on where the sound was originating from, but I would have put my money on it coming from the rusted fire escape directly above our heads. The acoustics, they felt like the voices were literally dropping down on us, surrounding our personal space. Mark, however, swore that it was coming from the pitch-black shadows of the storage yard, less than 10 feet behind us. Whatever the case, we didn't wait to investigate. We didn't even finish packing the bags properly. We grabbed the camera and the half-folded tripod, letting the extra lenses rattle and bang in the cases, not good, and sprinted for the car. I remember the sound of our boots hitting the pavement sounding deafeningly loud in that vacuum of silence, like we were being chased by the echoes of our own panic. As we scrambled into the car and slammed the locks, I looked back at the entrance of the alley. The street was wide open. There were no hiding spots, no other vehicles, and no possible way for a group of maybe 6 or 7 people to have vanished that quickly, at least without us hearing the sound of footsteps on the gravel or the fence rattling or something. In any case, we sped out of there and we never went back. I've spent a long time trying to rationalize what happened in that townhouse in Turin, but you cannot logic your way out of physical injuries. My parents went through a messy divorce when I was 14. My mum took the settlement and moved us into this vertical labyrinth of a place in a dense district in northern Italy. It was a turn-of-the-century build, renovated just enough to look modern, but the layout was still 1920s, cramped, not much to it, and always smelling of damp limestone. I took the attic, though. It was claustrophobic, with a ceiling that sloped so sharply that I could only stand up straight in the dead center. There was a narrow storage cavity built into the wall that I used as a closet, though the wood inside always felt soft, like it was perpetually rotting. To get to my bed, you had to walk down a windowless hallway, past a tiny utility room where the washing machine ran constantly. Because there was no ventilation, the air always felt heavy, thick with the cloying scent of detergent and wet denim. Now, I'm a skeptic for sure, but that room, let me tell you, it had a temperament. My mum was struggling, heavy drinking, bursts of rage followed by days of silence. The house, it seemed to feed on that too. It started small. I'd click the storage door shut before bed, and wake up at around 3 in the morning to find it standing open exactly 4 inches. I'd find my sweaters, which I kept folded at the very back of the shelf, lying in a heap in the middle of the floor. They were always damp as well, as if they'd been dragged through the utility room while I was sleeping. Then the sound started. Not ghostly footsteps, but like a shifting weight. I'd be lying there paralyzed, listening to something brushing against the hanging clothes in the utility area. It sounded exactly like a person running their hands over the texture or the fabric. The activity, it spiked whenever my mum and I fought. It was like the house used the negative energy as a battery almost. Then came the accident. So my mum was standing in the hallway when she just sort of dropped one day. She told the doctors that it felt like two massive hands had gripped her waist and snapped her downward. She suffered a complex spinal fracture. I know, crazy, right? The surgeons, they called it a spontaneous structural failure, but they couldn't explain the bruising on her hips, dark, hand-shaped marks pressed into her skin from behind. And while she was in recovery, the attic literally became a war zone. I stopped sleeping because every night at 2:44 in the morning, I'd wake up with the absolute certainty that someone was standing in the utility hallway just out of sight, and I could also hear a low rhythmic wheezing, like someone trying to catch their breath after a long climb, but they just couldn't. The breaking point, though, was a Thursday in November. I had two large metal drying racks in the narrow hallway, loaded with heavy winter coats. They were sturdy, wide-based racks. And around 3 in the morning, a sound like a car crash erupted in the hallway. I sat up, heart hammering, as the sound of screaming metal echoed off the sloped ceiling. One of the racks hadn't just tipped over, it had been hurled across the doorway. The legs were twisted into the frame so tightly as well that I was literally barricaded inside. When I tried to squeeze out the next morning, after getting no sleep, my leg caught on a jagged piece of the frame, and it sliced half my calf open, a deep, ugly gash that required 8 stitches in the end. My dad came over that afternoon to help me dismantle the rack. He's a practical guy too, but he turned pale when he saw the metal. The heavy aluminium poles had been sheared in half, and I mean, they weren't just bent, they were snapped and twisted like someone had used a massive pair of pliers and just went at it. He pointed to the floor. 3 deep triangular gouges had been ripped into the hardwood where the rack had been standing too. Final straw, that was a week later. So, my mum had been at a rehab facility, and I went back alone to grab some books at one point. As I reached the top of the stairs, I was hit by a wave of cold, stagnant air that smelled like old copper and wet salt. I didn't see anyone, but I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to look down. My cat was at the bottom of the stairs, back arched, letting out a low guttural hiss that I'd never heard before. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the ceiling directly above my head. I didn't grab my books. I didn't grab my coat. I just turned and ran, and as I hit the stairs, I heard the storage cavity door in my room slam shut with enough force to crack the wood. And after that, I never spent another night there. I moved my stuff out in broad daylight with some friends one day, and I still have a faint scar on my calf from where the cut happened. On humid nights, it even itches sometimes, and it always reminds me of my time there and what happened. So I had moved into this rental place on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona, in the dead of winter. It was a small, weather-beaten A-frame cabin that sat about 60 yards back from the main road, tucked deep into a natural depression in the land that made it completely invisible from the street. Surprisingly, too, the forest there, or if that's what you would call it, is thicker than you think, and when the wind dies down, the silence is so absolute that it feels heavy. The gate at the end of the drive was a massive weathered wooden thing that didn't actually latch. It usually just sort of leaned precariously against a cedar post, acting more as a visual suggestion of a boundary than any real physical barrier. Now, about a month into the lease, the 3 a.m. wake-up started. I'd find myself bolt upright in bed at exactly 2:58 a.m. or 2:59 a.m. every single night without fail. Mind you, there was no alarm, no notification from my phone, and no external noise that I could pinpoint. just a sudden jarring transition from deep sleep to total adrenaline-spiked alertness. I would lie there in the dark, my heart thumping against my ribs, waiting for a reason. At first, I tried to rationalize it as just being sensitive to the new air, or the sound of the old heater kicking on to fight the chill, but then the gravel started talking. It was a slow, heavy, deliberate crunch, a step and then a pause and then a step again. The sound, though, was unmistakable. It wasn't the light, frantic skittering of a coyote or the heavy, stumbling gait of a stray elk. It was the bipedal, rhythmic pace of something walking with intent. I would crawl across the cold floor, staying well below the sightline of the windows, and peel back the curtain just a fraction of an inch. The moonlight in the Arizona high desert is incredibly bright, especially in winter. It turns the soil there into a sort of flat silver mirror, so you can see almost every detail for like 100 yards. But the driveway was always a void. The gate would be closed, the trees there would be deathly still, and there wasn't a single soul in sight. Yet, as soon as I'd let the curtain fall and crawl back into bed, the sound would resume, with terrifying proximity. It sounded like it was right under the bedroom window now, as if something were pacing back and forth on the stones, waiting with infinite patience for me to acknowledge it. I eventually got fed up with the terror and tried the camera trick. I used a high-end trail cam with infrared night vision and strapped it to a thick tree about 20 feet from the front porch, pointed directly at the mouth of the driveway. On the fourth night, I woke up at around 3:01 a.m., heard the footsteps moving right past my door, and waited for morning with the lights on and a kitchen knife in my hand. When I reviewed the footage the next day, my stomach dropped. The video, it showed the driveway bathed in that eerie silver infrared glow, but there was absolutely nothing moving in the frame. No person, no animal, not even a swaying branch or a tumbling leaf. But the audio, which was recorded on a separate high-gain mic, was terrifyingly clear. You could hear the heavy steps hitting the gravel, getting louder and louder as they approached the cabin. Then came the distinct agonizing creak of the porch stairs under immense weight. Then you could hear breathing. On my recording, it wasn't just the wind. There was a sort of labored sound, like someone trying to breathe through a heavy head cold or a throat full of thick fluid. It lasted for exactly 12 seconds, and then the audio just flattened. It didn't fade away, it just stopped, as if the source had just simply ceased to exist. The turning point happened on a Tuesday afternoon, though, in broad, unforgiving daylight. I'd been out in town for supplies, and I got back to the cabin at around 2 p.m. I pulled into the driveway and saw that the gate wasn't just open. It had been lifted completely off of its steel hinges and laid perfectly flat on the ground. Now, it was a massive two-man job to lift that gate, yet there were no tire tracks in the mud and no human footprints anywhere. And the way that it looked, it seemed to have been moved with like surgical, silent precision. There wasn't scuff marks in the driveway, there were no footprints anywhere. I mean, it was just as if it had been picked up and laid there. I walked up to the house uneasy, my hands shaking pretty hard so I could barely grip my keys, and I checked the front door. I looked through the small brass peephole, expecting to see the trees, but instead, what I saw was solid, matte, and black. Like I said, it was daytime, so it wasn't the dark of the night or anything. It was almost like someone had pressed a piece of black felt directly against the glass on the outside. Either that, or maybe someone was so close that they had just blocked it out. I stepped back, though, paralyzed, and watched the tiny circle, and after 10 seconds of total silence, the blackness slid sideways and the view of the sunny porch returned. There was no sound of footsteps running away, no car door slamming, just a heavy, unnatural silence that felt like it was about to crush my eardrums. I didn't stay to pack a suitcase. I grabbed my dog, my laptop, and my keys, and I drove straight to a motel in Flagstaff. When I went back the next day with 2 friends to get my gear, we found 2 circular indentations in the fine dust on the porch, right in front of the door there. They weren't footprints, mind you. They were just these perfectly round, about 4 inches across, I would say, sort of circles, and pressed nearly an inch deep into the wood and the dirt, as if something incredibly heavy, with peg-like legs, as ridiculous as that sounds, had been standing there, perfectly still, staring through that peephole. I still find myself waking up at 3 a.m. every few weeks, listening for the sound of the gravel, even though I live in a high-rise now. Thankfully, I don't hear it anymore, and so I can just go back to sleep. I've spent most of my life trying to find a biological explanation for what happened when I was 7. But the more that I learn about high-altitude wildlife, the less the animal theory really holds up. It was 2012. My family had just moved from the Philippines to a pocket of land. We lived in a high-elevation area where the pines grow so thick that they actually muffle the sound out there. And at night, the darkness wasn't just black. It felt heavy, like it was pressing against the house because there were no streetlights out there. Our rental was a single-story ranch with massive floor-to-ceiling windows. At night, with the interior lights on, those windows became mirrors as well. You couldn't really see the forest, but from the outside in, the forest could see you with perfect clarity. And one night during dinner, I saw a reflection in the glass that didn't really belong. Standing near the edge of our gravel driveway, just where the kitchen light died out, was a shape. It was incredibly thin, not like a person at all, but more like a starved animal standing on 2 legs. It was ash pale and completely rigid. My dad looked, called it a trick of the light, and pulled the drapes. But as he pulled the fabric shut, I saw that the shape wasn't there anymore all of a sudden. It didn't seem to have run anywhere. It was almost like it had just vanished between frames. So after I went to bed, I heard a sound against my bedroom window. It wasn't a knock, it was more like a dry sliding friction sound, like a piece of stiff parchment being dragged across the glass or something. Then a series of very light rhythmic taps. I called for my mum, scared, and the second that I spoke, there was a heavy dull thud against the exterior wall. Not a slam, but like a vibration that felt like a massive weight had leaned onto the house. My parents came into my room and turned off the lights. We sat on the floor in the dark, and that's when the perimeter check started. We could hear this thing moving outside. Whatever it was heavy, and it didn't sound 4-legged. It sounded a bit like a person maybe, but fleshy. I know, that's really weird, but it was like a flat sort of thumping, fleshy sound. This thing circled the house 3 times by the sounds of it. Each time it passed a window, it didn't try to break the glass or anything, but instead we heard the sound of like fingernails or claws running along the window seals. It seemed to be testing the weather stripping maybe, and whatever it was, it seemed inquisitive, like it was surveying the integrity of the structure almost. Then we heard this sort of low vibrating hum, and it felt like it was coming from the floorboards beneath our feet. And then we heard a voice, or something trying to be a voice, but it sounded exactly like my mother's voice. Obviously, my mother was in the room with us, so we knew that it wasn't her, but my dad sat there with an iron fireplace poker, but he didn't move. I think that he knew that if we went out there that we would be stepping into its territory, and who knows what would happen. We sat there for hours and just listened to this thing moving around the house, and eventually the sun finally began to bleed over the ridgeline. When it did, the sounds just cut out. There was no final tap or scratching or anything. It just stopped, and we waited for, I would say, maybe 30 minutes before we went out, and we didn't see anything. When my dad went out to check the perimeter, he didn't find any footprints. He found a little bit of disturbed patches of dirt right against the foundation where maybe something could have been standing. But the most unsettling part were the windowsills for sure. There were these long, oily streaks in the dust. Something had reached up and wiped the dust away in thin 6-inch lines. And on the back door, there were these gouges in the oak, right at eye level. They weren't claw marks or anything, they sort of looked more like someone had taken a chisel to it and tried to peel the wood back to see what was underneath. We moved out 4 months later after that. My dad never actually talked about it again, but until the day the moving truck arrived, he never let us turn the kitchen lights on after sunset and never let us outside too. I still live roughly in the same location, but nowhere near that place, and sometimes I wish that I could go back and investigate what that was, but then again, it was a terrifying experience, and I don't know if I want to risk that. All my life, I've always been a skeptic for paranormal activity. I've always found a way to logically make sense of these experiences. This home that I've lived in has always had a story to it, though. When I was younger, my family told me that the previous owner of the home used to have a daughter, but one morning when she went out back in her yard to swing out on their family's tire swing, well, something bad happened. The story is that the rope had snapped somehow, and the tire had crushed the poor girl. I don't know her age, but I assume that she was probably around 5 to 8 years old. Soon after, the family moved out and the home sat for a good few years before we began living there. This swing to this day is far out from the property and is completely overrun with forest nature, but a rope is still attached to a branch and you can still see it. We had our own tire swing that was also far off from the property, but was much closer than the previous swing. And like her, my younger brother also had an incident. Our own tire swing snapped mysteriously and he broke his arm. After that, we never did fix that swing. As the years went by, there were plenty of incidences that the rest of my family would encounter. My mother and sister saw someone standing inside the house in front of a window while they were outside alone. No one else was home at the time, but my mother shouted out thinking that maybe one of us had arrived or something. When they didn't get a response from, "Hey, when did you get home?" they were puzzled. They really believed it was me they saw, so they assumed that I was in a bad mood and ignored them. They immediately went inside to check up on me, but I wasn't there. In fact, nobody was. My brother woke me up one night because he had heard voices outside. Everyone else was asleep, so he grabbed a shovel and handed me a cane and asked me to check out the outside with him. We searched the area and no one was out there. We do have a few neighbors, but all of their homes are quite a distance to walk. But there would be really no reason to come to our house, let alone around 1 a.m. in the morning. But here's where my own little story happens. Nothing ever really happened to me or when I was around, but my first and maybe last encounter happened this way. Nothing major, but still unexplainable to me, which is pretty big for me to be honest. So a few months ago, we were discussing about some of our worries about the house. My family went on about the tales I had mentioned and also many other that happened over the years. I explained to everyone that maybe they're just buying into the creepy stuff a little too much, and so their brains are leaning towards these experiences being paranormal. They think they saw a shadowy figure walk by every now and then because they're so open to the fact that the house is haunted. They truly believe the house is haunted by a demon or by the devil himself. We went our own ways after breakfast. Everyone in the house had errands of their own to run that day, and I was left alone in the home. I've been home alone plenty of times and nothing has ever happened. And after everyone left, I went into our garage because I like to store things in there like books and, well, mostly junk that I keep because they have sentimental value. I left the door cracked open because it's a bit hard to close. I'm a bit lazy, so I didn't want to struggle to open it this day and close the door a second time. It's not a lot of effort, but I'm just a bit lazy. For some reason, though, I had the feeling like someone was behind me. I turned around, and the second that I did, I heard the door close. Immediately, I thought that I was getting pranked because we were talking about spooky stuff earlier. I immediately ran up to the door. I gave it a push, but it didn't open. I realized then that the door was completely closed, even though I left it cracked open. So, using a minimal amount of effort, I pushed open the door and shouted, "Really, guys? Trying to scare me?" But I looked around that house, and I can assure you that no one was there. I had my things around 6 feet away from the door, so no one could have closed the door and sprinted away before I could see them, or at least hear them run away. I wasted no time getting to the door in an attempt to catch the prankster in the act, so the whole thing was very strange. My immediate thought was, maybe they're just fast. So I sprinted to the front door and looked outside to see no cars. No one was home. Again, I checked every room and every hiding spot that I could think of, but no one was home but me. I made myself a quick meal as I contemplated an explanation, but to no avail. I resumed the day like it never happened, but every now and then I think about that day. Was it a demon, like my family says? The devil? I recalled the story of the little girl who had died there, and I was around 8 when I was told the story. Now I'm 23. If she had anything to do with this, why now of all times? My idiot friends and I thought that it'd be fun to convene with the spirits pretty much daily one summer. We'd regularly break out a homemade Ouija board to see how goofy we could get. Because it gets too hot to do anything outside during this time of year, we had to find things to keep our 14 to 15-year-old selves entertained in, well, let's call her Jennifer's tiny little house in the 90s. Things went from casual and believable. I'm a teenager who died in a house fire, and I'm an old woman who died of natural causes, stuff like that, to downright disturbing. Like, I've never had a body, but I'm able to experience life down here if you say you accept me. For those, we'd always take our hands off and demand a new spirit. After what was essentially auditioning them, the gang and I managed to settle on a rather gentle entity who went by AJ Duke. AJ said that we could talk to him pretty much whenever we wanted. He was 8 years old and didn't want to cross over because he liked watching people go about their lives, and he'd been doing this for hundreds of years. Sounded like it was made up, but whatever. It was a Ouija board after all. All of it was kind of made up, right? Well, it was all well and good for about a week or so. He would tell us things about other people in the neighborhood in his usual terrible spelling, and it was always hot tea. We were so polite back and forth with the thank you and you're so adorable. Cringe, I know, but we'd occasionally bring AJ up in jokes and casual banter when we weren't playing. He was kind of like a fourth wheel for a few days there, but then it got weird. AJ revealed that our playing was attracting bad spirits onto the property. He said that we shouldn't talk as much anymore, but if we asked for him when we started, he would try and take up the space so they couldn't talk to us. We felt very protected by this little dude, corny as it sounds. AJ was always around and game to talk when we sat back down to gab. Soon, though, we started noticing the thing getting faster and stronger. Our arms would feel pulled this way and that, and go to letters faster and with incredibly skillful precision. Increasingly, we'd end up putting the board away because the vibe started to feel super sour in the room. It's gross to say, but the gentle aspect that we liked about this spirit was replaced with wording that was only better spelled, but sexual and catty in nature. And even though we'd put the thing away once it got all weird, we'd always go right back later into the evening or the next day. It became sort of compulsive in a way. Anyway, one night, Jennifer's older sister stopped by to visit their mum, but decided to hang with us for a while. It was literally the first time she'd ever did this, and it felt really cool to have someone who was pretty popular in high school kick it with us. When she came into Jennifer's room and saw the Ouija board, though, she got instantly piqued. We showed her what we usually got up to, and she was skeptical at first. She said, "I'm going to go into the hall and hold some fingers up. Let's see if the Ouija board can get it." So she does it, and one by one, it kept nailing it. You could see the smirk wipe off her face and go into something akin to fear at this point. Then you could see the fear go into a desperate curiosity. She sat down and played with us, getting some gossip about her parents' divorce that we didn't even think to ask about. It didn't take long for the sexual catty stuff to get cranked up again. She was looking at us with a face that also felt the air shift. When we did our usual bellyache and hands-off ritual over it, though, she protested. She thought this was when it really gets interesting. And what did that thing suggest we do not 5 minutes after we decided that she might be right? It suggested that we hold a seance. And you can probably guess what gang went along with it because cool big sis got super excited at the idea. So we did. The board told us to get into a circle and to hold some hands, then call for a spirit to appear. Mind you, the Ouija isn't spelling things out as cleanly. It'd be something like circle, CIRCL, hold hand, invite, and that's the good spelling. Anyway, we do as instructed. Nothing was happening at first, in spite of Big Sister's insistence that if you're there, show us a sign on repeat. Still, our big round eyes would look around at each other. I'm not sure if we were hoping something would happen or if we were waiting for one another to call it off. Nobody wants to be the ultimate nerd, though, and if we played our cards right, we might be able to hang with her crew as they smoked cigarettes between classes and generally looked beautiful and cool. "If you're there, do something," she commanded. A newspaper clipping taped to my friend's mirror flickered and we all jumped a bit, but she confirmed that it was the ceiling fan and said that it does that periodically. There's maybe another minute of Big Sister making demands and I was certain someone was going to speak up and break the circle. But then Big Sis dropped, "If you're here, I give you permission to show yourself." And not even a moment after she uttered those words did she leap off her feet and scream while pulling her shirt off. "Get off me," she was screaming, and Jennifer immediately hopped up and pulled the cord to turn the light back on. Her big sister threw herself back first into the wall as though smashing an invisible something that was on her. I remember a single stream of spit hanging from her mouth as it hung open for a moment. It was just really odd to see such a cool person looking decisively, well, not. But I digress. It was absolutely terrifying. She spun around and screamed, "What is it?" over and over, and just below her bra strap, suddenly 3 scratches appeared, in some places deep enough to draw a bit of blood. We instinctively huddled around her, cloaking her in a sort of protective shield, but had no clue what to do, except to move that huddle downstairs and into the living room where her mother was watching TV. She leapt up and took a look at Big Sis's back as we frantically explained. And what we saw was AJ in a sort of welt and blood form. AJ. After this, her mum made us burn that thing. She kept saying, "I told you not to mess with it, I told you." And in rare fashion, Jennifer didn't utter a word of protest at all. She just asked advice on the best way to burn it. A strange bonding experience, standing in the backyard at night and watching her mother, usually quiet, sullen and withdrawn those days, put one arm around Big Sis and used the other to continually douse the doomed board with lighter fluid. In the end, I never did get to stand outside with the cool kids. In fact, if anything, she pretended not to even see us, even harder. So full disclosure, I haven't told many this story and, well, after typing it out, it sounds really out there, I realize that. I've had several paranormal encounters over the course of my life, but this one was the first. When I was a kid, I had a friend named Boo. I called him this because you could see through him. Boo and I played a lot when I was little, even introduced him to the rest of my family. We pretty much did everything together. He was cool because he changed his shape. He could be little like me or big like my dad. He could walk through walls and flew with wings on his back. A week or two before my 4th birthday, Boo wanted to play in the front yard, which was pretty normal for us. After a while, he said that we had been friends a long time and he wanted me to meet his family. He said that he told his parents and siblings about me, and he said everyone was super excited to finally meet me. He told me that they were going to throw me a big party with all the cakes and candies that I could eat. As you could imagine, at this age, I was very excited. So I asked Boo where his family lived. He told me that they lived in the other world, but that it was really easy to get to. I asked how to get there. I was concerned that I couldn't go because, well, I didn't have wings like Boo did. He said that we didn't have to fly to get there, and all I had to do was follow him away from my house. He wanted me to go down the street and into a small grove of trees. I got kind of scared about getting into trouble, and so I told Boo that Mummy and Daddy say that I'm not allowed to leave the yard. He said that they're not with us right now, so they won't know that we even left. Dad was inside watching TV at the time, and I think Mum was at the store. I still wasn't sure though. He told me though that we were best friends and I should trust him. Boo then took me by the arm and started leading me out of the yard. He had opened the gate for me because I didn't know how to. I walked with him to the street corner. I stopped when I was suddenly filled with an overwhelming sense of fear. Boo asked why I stopped. I told him that I was scared, because that's the furthest I'd ever been away from the house without Mummy and Daddy. He said not to worry though, because we're almost there. His grip then tightened around my arm, and he started pulling me hard. I told him that he was hurting me and to stop. Boo then told me, in a very flat voice, to be quiet. He said that if I didn't behave that I wouldn't get my party, and that they would have to throw all the food away. I started to cry at that and asked why he was being so mean to me. Boo said that it didn't matter because we would be in the other world soon anyway. Crying, I told him that I didn't want to go anymore. He responded by saying if I didn't go with him, then he would just leave me there, and I would have to find my own way home. I said fine, and yanked my arm away from him. He then made his face look really weird, like not human weird. There were shapes that shouldn't be there, and parts of it were really sharp. And then all of a sudden, he just disappeared. I did make it back home and sat on the porch and cried. Boo was my best friend at the time. I didn't understand why he was so mean to me. A few minutes later, though, my mum returned from the grocery store and asked me what was wrong. I told her everything about mine and Boo's fight. She looked back, though, and saw the gate was still open, and reminded me that I wasn't allowed to go outside without her or my dad. My father also got into trouble for not keeping an eye on me. But that wasn't the last time that I saw Boo. He was never the same after that, though. He kept being kind of mean to me, and one day I told him that we weren't friends anymore, because friends aren't mean to each other. So I told Boo to leave and to never come back. And after that, I never did see him again. Years later, my mum told me how scared she was after I told her about what happened, because she said that gate was open that day when she got home from the store, and she knew that I was much too little to open it by myself. So, a kind of scary thing just happened to me a couple of hours ago, and I'm still kind of shaken up by it. A woman was knocking at my door, and when I answered, she said that she heard a child screaming and an older male yelling. She told me that it was super loud, and she heard an older man saying something along the lines of, "People are looking for you now." I live in a duplex with my boyfriend and dog. We live on the main floor, and we have a neighbor who lives by himself in the upstairs unit. We have absolutely no children. But I also found it odd because moments before this I was in my shared laundry room that you access from the backyard with the back door open. I always do that to let my dog out into the backyard, and I can assure you that I heard absolutely nothing. The way that she was talking and the look on her face, though, seemed really genuine, so I was trying to reassure her that we had no children, and she probably just heard one of the neighbor's kids or something. We live close to the city in a populated area, so there's lots of kids and they scream when they're playing all the time. We just kept going in circles, though. I didn't have any children in the home, and she most likely had the wrong house. I even offered her to peek over the fence and check the yard if she wished, but otherwise, that was really all I could do. But when I'd say these things, she'd just stare with this accusatory look in silence, then start up again on what she had heard. That's when she began to subtly force herself through the doorway, like a foot or a hand. By this point, our upstairs neighbor and my boyfriend heard what was going on and joined me at the door. She just refused to accept my explanation, though, and eventually fully got herself into the doorway. She clearly wasn't going to leave, so that's when I called the police. She stood in that doorway until they arrived. After the cops talked with her and asked us questions, we found out that she admitted to using meth earlier that morning. So they told us that she was just experiencing hallucinations due to coming down from that. But they had to keep telling her that you're free to go now, and she very hesitantly left. She kept turning around and looking at the house, so the cops even hollered out, "Let's just do a quick check," to make her believe they searched the house. And I know that this could have been so much worse and isn't the craziest thing, but still, I'm really nervous that she's going to come back, and I can't stop checking my windows. Plus, someone that high on meth, well, they can't be the safest, right? This took place a few months ago. So, there are these 3 abandoned houses as well as 3 barns close to my house, and are going to be getting torn down here in the next couple of months. So me and my siblings thought, why not go and check them out before that happens? I'd already checked them all out with a buddy, but I wanted to do it again, but with my siblings this time because, why not? We had only explored one of the houses previously because there was a small window that we could crawl through into the basement, and another hole through the wall that we crawled through to enter the house, since all the doors were boarded up pretty much. There are 2 more houses we haven't explored yet, one being really small and the other being absolutely huge. After some research on the internet, though, it made sense as it seemed as if the house was leased to multiple people, mostly around the age of college or to younger families who maybe couldn't afford to rent entire apartments. The time before, when I was with my friend, we brought a screwdriver with all sorts of those attachment things that go on the end so that we could unscrew all the different bolts and then used a hammer for the nails too. When we got there, the board was already torn off luckily, even though it wasn't the week prior when we first tried to go in, when we didn't have the screwdrivers. Also, I'll call this house the Red House since it has red brick. To describe this red house, it's like you connected 2 average double-story houses together. It is that big, and I mean, we ended up taking an hour to explore it, but that's because we were looking around too. This time when me and my buddy explored it though, it was pretty cool. Not too much graffiti and lots of stuff everywhere on the ground. We found some old cheap purses, Pokemon and baseball cards, a bunch of broken keyboards, books and old school supplies, plus a lot of other completely random things. There was even an old tanning bed that I think we discovered was from the late 80s. There were the occasional drug beetles and pills, usually in corners of old bedrooms or in the bathrooms. And the next time, I just wanted to experience this again with my siblings. This time, it was night when my mother was asleep, so we could actually get away with it. I dropped them off in my car and I drove half a mile to a trailhead where I could park my car and it would be hidden. I then rode an electric scooter the half mile to where they were so we could go in. Now, there was this gate that we had to go over since there was barbed wire, and so I folded up the electric scooter and hid it in the tall grass. This road behind the gate, it led to the first house that we had already been in, so we were just trying to go to the big one. From here, you have to walk pretty far through this tall grass to get to the red house. As we approached it, we finally turned our flashlights on and then entered this house. Last time, me and my friend were calling out to make sure nobody was inside, but this time it was nighttime and I didn't want to risk somebody calling the cops since they heard yelling near the abandoned houses at like 2 a.m. Regardless though, it was a stupid decision. In any case, we made our way in and we looked around. I think it's also important to note here that this isn't the front door, it's actually the back door. One of two back doors, in fact. The house is on a hill, so from the road, it sort of looks like one story, but on the other side you can see that it's definitely 2 stories. This back door is in the very corner of the house, so you sort of explore from one end to the other. As we walked through, I could have sworn that I heard some light footsteps. But this is an older house. I looked it up in fact, and it was built in 1964, has 7 acres of land and is 3,800 square feet, so pretty big, yeah? But anyway, it didn't sound any different from when me and my friend first explored it, and it was night, so quiet sounds were extra loud. As we made it through the other end of the bottom of the house where the staircase was, and made our way up, I heard more footsteps. And this time, I told my siblings that we should probably head out. They didn't hear anything, but they were also under the assumption that we were the only ones there, and they weren't being very cautious or aware, I guess you could say. When you go up the stairs, though, on one side it leads to the garage, which is very small for such a large house, again, probably because it's older. And on the other side you go past a short hallway, and it leads to the kitchen and a family room with a sort of lounge area, I think you would call it. This whole area is super open and it feels like a lot of empty space, but it only covers around half the upstairs. On the other side is a straight hallway with around 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. And that was when I thought that I saw somebody moving from one bedroom across the hallway to the other, from left to right. But my light didn't go very far since I was using my phone light. I start angrily whispering to my siblings who are already kind of close to the hallway, which leads to where I saw the person, as to not yell but to get attention urgently. They ignore me though, which really ticked me off, and I quickly walk across this open area to try and maybe yank their arm, until this time we all hear something drop. In my opinion, the guy dropped it on purpose to let us know that he was there, but after this next part, really, I'm not completely sure. Immediately, my siblings and I jump. It sounded like a bookshelf was knocked over or something, and since it was really loud and heavy as we could feel the ground vibrate as we were upstairs, it was now confirmed that somebody was definitely there with us. We turned around and started running to the staircase, which is pretty much in a straight line. The bottom floor sort of zigzags around until it leads to a hallway that goes straight to the other side of the house. As we make our way around the zigzag rooms and make our way to the corner with the hallway, we start hearing running upstairs towards that staircase. Obviously, we're already running, so we don't slow down. We turn the final corner and make our way outside, where I run in a straight direction and then to the left in an attempt to hide in the tall grass, which also has a direct line to the other side of a huge grass area to where the gate is. I lay down, and when my siblings run out behind me, I tell them to get down as well. We were maybe 30 or so feet deep into the grass when I see a dark figure run out of the house a few feet, stop, look around, and run into the small house next to this one, which is only like 50 or so feet away. I thought that house was all boarded up still, but it looked like he ran to the side of the house where I guess his entryway was. There was a large shed thing in the way, so I couldn't see exactly where he went, but I knew that there was barbed fence over there, so he would have to run behind to where we were to follow us, as there is maybe a 20-foot wide gap where there is no barbed fence, so I guess that way vehicles could enter. In any case, I heard his footsteps running around, but I couldn't see where he was. We started to sort of army crawl across the grass, but really slowly as to not make much rustling noise. We start crawling faster, but then I heard his footsteps stop, so either he ran away or was stopped, maybe looking at us. I kept crawling on all fours since the grass was now tall enough to still cover me, and I was looking behind to see if I could see his outline in the dark, which thankfully I couldn't see him. We started to hear a cracking sound though, and it sounded like he was cracking the plywood boards, but I don't know why he would do that. I don't know what it was, to be honest. It then sounded like he was frustrated though, as we could hear loud grunts. We just kept crawling though. We were maybe crawling for a good 5 minutes to get to the other side, even if we were far enough for him to not see us. It honestly felt like a lot more, and every minute felt like 10. We eventually get to the road though, which led to the gate, and at this point, we stop outside the gate and wait for the few cars to pass before we crawl through. I have my siblings crawl under first, and I swear I heard running through the tall grass behind me, but as I made it under and through and started running, it didn't actually look like he was following us. Maybe he was too far behind for me to see, but I'm not sure. Also, yes, I did get my scooter, which my brother had already unfolded and was riding away with me, and my sister running behind. We didn't stop until we got to the trailhead off to the side of the main road, where we literally threw the scooter into the back, jumped inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there. In the end, we drove off peacefully, knowing that this person was definitely homeless and could not get into a car to drive off after us. He was also probably not on anything, as he was moving too quick, which I don't know if it would be better or worse for us if he was and we ended up having to fight back, but luckily we didn't have to. In the end, we made it home safe and sound, and we didn't speak about it at all with our parents. My siblings, they kind of laughed about it more after the first week, but it still scared me knowing just how serious that was. I don't think they actually realized just how dangerous that whole situation actually was. We survived though, and I guess that's all that really matters. Also, definitely, I do not plan on ever going back. This happened almost 3 years ago. During COVID, I was sort of lost and extremely bored without human interaction. That was until me and my buddies found mountain biking when our parents allowed us to see each other outside. Living in Washington State, there's a lot of woods perfect for mountain biking trails. Us being under the age of 16 at the time, we had no license to drive in actual mountain bike parks, so instead, we built them. Apart from the one trail already near our house with a 30-foot gap jump, which was way above our skill level at the time, we wanted to make something new. Basically, there is an entrance to this trail near my friend's house, and you walk down it a ways until you find the normal trail. To get to our trail, you find this one spot on the trail that turns 90 degrees to the left, but instead, you go to the right of the trail through all this mud, weave between these fallen trees and tree branches, and from there, you go right where it sort of curls around until it goes straight again. From there, you go straight through this small pathway, which is still hidden from all the ferns, until you reach this abandoned forest road. Now, you follow this forest road down, which goes for about 80 yards or so. It's also covered in huge amounts of mud, and if you were there, you would see all the clumps with our footprints going about 6 or maybe even more inches deep, especially in some spots where it's extremely deep. But there are more fallen trees on this forest road, but if you continue to make your way down until it sort of stops, and then go off to the right and walk around this hidden pathway that weaves and curls all around this huge area of ferns for maybe another 60 or so yards, you finally reach the bottom of the trail that we made. It probably takes about 10 minutes to get there, but around 5 on a good day where it isn't wet, like during the summer. Essentially, you have no reason to be there unless you're either lost, which is almost impossible to do unless you purposely wander off the trail, or are looking for it. And on this particular day, my buddies couldn't go out to help build, so I decided to bring my younger siblings along. The only reason I felt scared going alone was around a week earlier, me and one of my friends thought that we found a cougar den with some scat nearby in a few spots. I also just didn't want to be alone that far out. My sister decided to come with, but my brother, I guess, had a friend who he was going to hang out with or something. Anyways, me and my sister ride our bikes there, carry them through the hidden area, and throw them off into some fern bushes right before you get to the forest road. From there, we went down that long trail. The main reason why I was out there was to be sure that no trees had fallen, because we had some extra winds the days prior, and so we knew that if we needed to bring some bigger saws to cut. And so if we could figure this out, then we would know if we would need to bring some bigger saws to cut them. There wasn't any damage, but around a week later, a tree did end up blocking the end of the trail, ironically. Also, it's probably important that I mention that it was a pretty rainy day that day. So, we were there for around 10 minutes while I showed my sister the trail, when all of a sudden I get this call from my mum telling me that my brother was asking where we were since he was going to come and find me. I guess he had a change of plans or something, but me being lazy, I told my sister to go walk back down and wait outside the trail entrance on the neighborhood to wait for him. This would also give me the opportunity to do some work while she was doing this. I called her every few minutes or so since my brother should have arrived, but he hadn't at that point. About 10 minutes go by, so she's been waiting for about a good 20 minutes when my mum called me again telling me that he had returned and couldn't find us. At this point, I was kind of annoyed, but I called my sister telling her to come back down and to make sure nobody was around or following her for when she entered the trail, as to not give our spot away. I was waiting from anywhere between 7 to 10 minutes when I was wondering what was taking her so long. So when I walked over to the end of the forest road and I saw her walking all the way on the other side, I was kind of relieved. She wasn't walking on the forest road yet, but she was perpendicular to it, walking towards it. From this angle, the bushes go from anywhere between hip to shoulder height, and so I could see her upper body with her hood on. This is when I realized that I didn't remember her wearing a white sweatshirt or windbreaker. And once the person turned the corner, I could tell that it was not her at all, and was actually likely a grown man. I quickly backpedaled off to the side and down the hill a little bit behind a tree so I could call my sister. I was wondering where she was and if she had gotten lost because, after all, it's pretty hard to get to. I also didn't want this person to steal our bikes, and did I forget to mention my bike was over $2,000? Don't worry, I made it worth it for how much I ended up riding it, but it also was going to last a lifetime if properly maintained. Anyway, with my worries about my bike in mind, I called my sister, and the second that I heard the first ring, I heard a voice on the other side of the tree that I was hiding behind say, "What are you doing?" It was my sister. I quickly told her to get down as to not be seen by the person. I didn't want them to find the trail that we were building, as I didn't want to get into any sort of trouble, and I also wanted to keep it hidden. I also wanted to get back to the bikes, and she could tell by the panic in my voice that I was serious, and when I told her that there was a person and she looked, she said, "No, there isn't." I peeked over, and sure enough, nobody was there now. But I knew what I saw though, and so we made our way back, walking past where I saw the person. I was really worried the bikes would be gone by this point, so we trekked through the mud and my heart was absolutely pumping. And during this time, I just couldn't help the feeling of being watched. I could feel the adrenaline rush, and I almost knew that they were off in the trees, watching us. I was so distracted thinking that they were going after the bikes when I saw them disappear that I didn't even think that they would be hiding. Thankfully, as we made our way down the trail while acting as calmly as possible, we arrived to see the bikes, which were still indeed there. At one point, it did look like there was a different shoe print though, because it was slightly larger and differently shaped, but it was hard to tell in this area. Now, we made our way all the way back, and while I constantly looked behind me, making sure that we weren't being followed, I could have sworn that I heard things and saw things out there in the forest. Towards the end, where the trail splits off and leads to the neighborhood, there's a short but wide wooden bridge which is covered in dirt. Thankfully, since it was raining and you could easily see footprints, I could see the extra pair. You could vividly see my first set of footprints to get to the trail, as well as my sister's, with an additional set of her footprints going back and then returning, and then a shoe print on top of hers showing that it was most recent. This confirmed my sighting. My heart dropped once again, and we quickly got out of there, still making sure that nobody else was behind us. When I got home, I didn't hesitate to tell my parents, who only told me that the next time that I need to be with her at all times. I could tell that they partly didn't believe me or thought that I was just over-exaggerating or something. All these questions, though, went through my head. On one side, we live in a pretty nice neighborhood, and even if it was a random person who didn't live there, why were they there? If they were maybe worried about why a random little girl was wandering off in the trails, why did they even bother following? And when they did, why so far behind and so creepily? Why not call out? If it was a worker, why were they wearing what they were wearing? Wouldn't there have been boot prints? Wouldn't they be wearing a vest or a helmet? A truck parked outside the trail. Wouldn't they have something else with them? And why hide like that? If they thought that she was alone originally and they walked past two bikes, why didn't they keep going? It wasn't until they must have seen her talking to me or just saw me when they hid. Why did I feel like I was being watched when I was under the assumption the person was off stealing my bike and not even near us anymore? Why the footprints entering but no going back? Why is someone hiking in an area like this in that attire? How did they even find the area by themselves? They definitely found it because of my sister, and when they did, they followed? When they saw how hard it was to navigate, why keep going? Why feel the need to hide from two younger kids as well? And most importantly, what would have happened if I wasn't there at that point? Anyways, I feel the need to explain some more details too, because the footprints were maybe half an inch to an inch bigger than my shoes. My shoes were smaller at the time since they were beaters, but regardless, my guess is that this person was anywhere from 2 inches shorter than me to 2 inches taller. I never got a good look at their face, but they were definitely white or had lighter skin. I'm going to be honest and tell you that the person wasn't huge or massive, trying to make it sound more scary than what it is, but they definitely did fill out their sweatshirt or coat, so they were pretty stocky, but definitely much bigger than me at the time as well. At this point in time, I believe I was around 5'8" and maybe 130 pounds, so pretty small. It's also important to note that, I don't know, maybe the person was innocent, but the whole situation seemed very fishy. And like I said, I always wonder exactly what would have happened to my sister if I wasn't there that day. I grew up in the early 90s in a small town. During the warm summer days, my father would often make me turn off the TV and go outside to play. We lived in a house on a cul-de-sac, but a few lots didn't have houses built on them yet, so there weren't many neighbors or any kids my age to play with. So I was often left to find ways to entertain myself while playing outside. I vividly remember on 2 different occasions being visited by a strange man who resembled looking kind of like a hippie. He was about 6 feet tall, slender with long brown hair and a beard. I had to have been between the ages of 5 or 7 during this time. On the first occasion, I was playing outside in my inflatable kiddie pool. I decided that it was time to put the inflatable pool away so I could switch to a different activity. My dad didn't allow us to switch activities until we put away our toys, so leaving the inflatable pool in the front yard just wasn't an option. So there I was at about 6 years old, on my front porch struggling to deflate this extra-large 7-foot blow-up kiddie pool when this strange guy started walking towards me. I was close enough to the front door of the house where, if I had to scream for help, someone would have heard me, so I didn't feel too afraid by his approach. He greeted me, though, and explained to me that if I squeezed the rubber nozzle part of the inflatable pool, then the air would escape more easily. He gently took the kiddie pool from me, deflated it, folded it up neatly, handed it back to me with 2 hands, and then slowly just walked away. Obviously, that was a bit weird, but about a year had gone by and I was out playing again, this time riding my bike. At some point, my chain had popped off my bike, so I walked my bike around to the backyard in the shade so I could try and put the bike chain back on into the gears. About 10 minutes later, I saw that same hippie guy walking down the driveway into my backyard. My first thought was, how did he know that I was even back here? My second thought was, why is he so comfortable walking into our backyard with my dad in front of the yard mowing grass? Most neighbors were intimidated by my father's large size, or our big Great Dane, so his confidence and trespassing intrigued me. He greeted me again the same like before, then knelt down eye level to me on the opposite side of my bike, and proceeded to reset the chain on my bike. I thanked him for his help, and he strolled off again. Later on that day during dinner, I questioned my father about the man who had walked into our yard and helped me to fix my bike. I figured my father had known the stranger since he allowed him to walk into the backyard to help me fix my bike like that. But my father told me that that was impossible because he had been in the front yard all day doing yard work and washing cars, and he would have seen anyone approaching the house since we lived on a cul-de-sac. I also confessed that it wasn't my first time meeting this man, and he had helped me out last summer with my kiddie pool. My father had a look of discomfort on his face and asked me what the guy looked like. It was a small town and everybody knew everyone, but he could not figure out who this guy could have been. My dad instructed me not to talk to strangers and to alert him if I saw the guy approaching our home ever again. But after that, I never saw the strange guy again. Fast forward to recently a few weeks ago, I was talking to a close friend and randomly remembered those 2 visits from my childhood and shared the story with my close friend. After a few laughs, my friend asked me what exactly did the strange guy look like, to see if he had seen anyone that resembled him on any crime documentaries. I explained to him that the guy honestly looked like a white Jesus dressed in a linen button-up shirt and leather sandals. We laughed a bit more about the whole thing, and really, that was it. This takes place some years ago in France. We wanted to camp with my family during summer holidays, and so we took our motorhome. There was my father, my mother, my little brother, 4 years old, and me, 10 years old at the time. After traveling for a day, my father looked at the map to find a campsite. Unfortunately, it was full though. It was already getting dark, so we decided to drive again for a bit and found a parking lot with a few motorhomes already there and some trucks. After getting installed and eventually having a bite to eat, we went to bed. For context too, there were 2 beds in the RV, one in the back where my parents sleep, and one in the front called the overcab bed where I slept with my brother. At night, my father had the habit to pee outside, in the grass, the forest, etc. And after we went to bed, we chatted a little bit and eventually slept. Now, in the middle of the night, I woke up to hearing some noises like rustling or someone searching for something, so I thought that it was my mother or father. After a few seconds, I decided to see, but it was dark and all I could see is a black silhouette like 2 meters or 6'5" in the living room that opened the door to go out. I immediately thought that it was my father that wanted to pee and go out, so I just went back to sleep. In the morning we all woke up, and after having some breakfast, my mother couldn't find her handbag and the bag that we had our camera and photo camera in. And that was the moment that I realized that the silhouette that I saw was not my father, but someone who had broken in and robbed us that night. After explaining to my parents what I saw, we went to the police and they told us that it was a common thing here. We never found out who it was, and we lost the bags, but I still get shivers when I think about it 20 years later. I mean, what if I had said something to the man? Would he have fled? Would he have attacked us? Honestly, I think that we were lucky to have just been robbed that night. For my safety, I won't reveal which park system I work for, but it is important to know for this story that I, 19 and female, work a position at a Michigan nature park, not entirely dissimilar to that of a park ranger. My job duties usually include manning the entry booth, locking up the buildings at night, etc. And although not a usual duty, sometimes they ask me to walk or take a park vehicle through some of the trails, as I'm on the younger side but still have several years of experience at the park. I'm a relatively experienced outdoorsman. Now, I've had some odd things happen to me while on the job that I just cannot quite explain. I'm decently well versed in some areas of the paranormal, and although not entirely relevant, it's of note that I am also a Norse pagan, as a part of a family belief, and often wear protective symbols as well. To be honest, I've started wearing them more since these odd things have been happening too. I've tried looking into it myself, but overall I'm overwhelmed and not sure where to look, so a friend suggested that I share this here and, well, maybe get some help. So there are 2 things in particular that I want to ask about. I usually work the night shift, and this night in particular it was raining a lot and the conditions were getting unsafe. I was posted out in the booth, which is multiple miles from the office, so when things took a turn for the worse, my boss radioed me back. Some people who don't spend a lot of time in the woods, they don't realize how dark and deep the woods can actually get, much less in the dark at night. But I had a flashlight and the light from the booth, which gave me probably 30 feet of visibility. And when I went to grab my stuff so that I could lock up the booth and get to my car, I swore that I saw something that moved very human-like, but moved in a really odd way too. Like, the only way that I can describe it is as if a horse-deer hybrid tried to run like a person. But there were no people out there, and it was most definitely not a deer. I'm probably not describing it in the best way, but whatever it was very off. So I got to my car ASAP, and it didn't start right away, which was a bit odd, but not entirely out of character for my car, but When I turned the key a second time, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and it looked like whatever it was had gotten closer. The drive goes without incident, but I'm still off about what I saw, and when I get closer, I radio in to see if they need me to pick anyone up. And the radio doesn't work right, which was definitely very out of character. I mean, these radios are designed to work in awful conditions, and I was the closest I'd been to any sort of signal in a while. I chalked it up to the weather and pulled into the office. But as I do, something runs past me. I didn't get a good look at what it was, but I can assure you that it was not a person. And I'm telling you that there's not an animal in the woods that I know of that looks like either of the things that I saw. And honestly, I just can't seem to shake this. The second thing that I would like to ask about is, this happened more recently and is what prompted me to finally reach out to somewhere like this. I was walking the trails for security purposes close to closing. We close at around 11 p.m. and start a final walkthrough around 9 p.m. We do this to make sure that no one's stuck on the trail or hurt, so they aren't stuck overnight when there's fewer staff and none that patrol those trails. So I was walking one of our trails and I was pretty deep in the woods already, as I'm a fairly fast hiker, and this is a trail that I know well as well. I was already about 2 miles into the trail when things started to get a bit weird. I hear a noise off in the distance, and at first I thought it could be a coyote or maybe an owl, so I pressed on. Coyotes stay off the trails, won't go after people unless they have dogs, and dogs are banned in the woods here anyway. And they know when we do our sweeps, so I wasn't too concerned. But then the noises got weirder. I'm used to the sounds of the woods, and I know the area and the wildlife very well, and I have never once in my life heard that sound before. It didn't come from any animal that I recognize, and it most definitely was not human. I've never aborted a sweep before, even when I've had coyotes nearby, but it just didn't feel right this day, and so I got out of there. We're allowed to use our judgment in these cases, thankfully, so I didn't get in any trouble, but if anyone has any idea as to what either of these things could be, please let me know, and I would really, really appreciate your help. This was around the winter of 2006. I was 8 years old at the time, and I was living in Thunder Bay, Ontario with my family, and we lived by the auditorium and the Canada Games complex. There was a big hill at the east end of the parking lot that myself and the neighborhood kids would go sledding at. Usually our parents would come, but since we were right across the streets, if it was daylight, they'd sometimes let us go out on our own since it was only about 400 meters from the front door. Now, one day, a few of us went to the sliding hill. There was 4 of us, myself and 3 kids from a big family from down the street. There was the older sister and 2 of the younger brothers. Everything went as usual until we noticed an old blue Ford F-150. I still remember the rust on the wheel well and the hood. The driver, he just sat there watching us. He was older, mid-40s to 50, dark grey shoulder-length hair and a salt and pepper beard. He was sat there smoking and watching us. We all immediately felt pretty creeped out and didn't take our eyes off of him. I would often watch a lot of crime shows with my mum at that time, and I could feel the hairs standing on my neck as I knew something was just off. The older sister of the family said that we'll slide down the hill and just walk home as he just kept watching us. But he got out of his truck at one point and started walking toward us, and we immediately took off running across the parking lot, and he just stood there on the top of the hill smoking and watching us run in a panic. They told their parents and were told not to go back, but I for some reason was afraid to tell mine. A few months later, we were driving up the street that we lived on, Beverly Street, and as I was looking out of the window, I got that heavy, dreadful feeling in my body. That was when I saw his truck in the parking lot of the apartments right next to the clinic that my mum would take me to, and the convenience store that I would bike to with some of the older kids in my neighborhood. I never biked up there again, and when I would see the truck driving on the main drag, I'd hide in the bushes or behind the hedges every time. Only once did I see him drive through the neighborhood, and it was right before I moved. I was playing in the yard of the kids that I was sliding with that following summer, and we all just stood there and watched as he slowed down and glanced out the window, cigarette in his mouth. Only a few of us had seen him, and the dread that we felt as he looked over at each of us was indescribable. I moved a few weeks later after that, but I never forgot about that day. I recently in my adult life moved from Manitoba to southern Ontario, and I decided to drive by my old house on the way, but when I drove by those apartments, though, I never saw the truck. I don't know why I was looking for it, but I still felt something odd in me. This was a long time ago, so I don't remember my exact age at the time, but I was very young, probably around kindergarten age. My family was living in an old farmhouse that my grandparents lived next door to. The house was built in the 1830s, and this was the 1990s, so the whole property is over 160 years old, and everything definitely looked a bit old and a little bit worn. My experience was during a cold winter night, either late November or early December. The sun is fully set and it's pretty dark. Being out in the countryside, there's not much light at night and it's dead quiet. My mum sent me to my grandparents to return some movies that I had borrowed. It was a pretty short walk, but I had to cross the farm driveway to get there, and that is where my oldest and most vivid memory takes place. I'm a child walking alone at night, even though now I know both my mum and grandma were watching me, so I was pretty scared. Once I got to the farm driveway, I remember feeling just not right. I wasn't exactly scared, but my anxiety was very high. I remember turning to look down at the barns and seeing my dad out in the workshop, and then I turned back to start walking, and that's when I saw the boy and his horse. I remember them so vividly. They had a pale off-white glow, but it didn't emanate from them. You couldn't see light on any of the surroundings, but the boy was wearing dark underwear with suspenders, a white long-sleeve shirt, and a hat with a white brim. He was holding the reins of the horse. I don't remember the horse as well as the boy, but I remember that it was fully saddled and looked healthy. I cannot remember the color, though. It was either white, brown, or a mix of that, like most horses, unfortunately. It for sure wasn't black, though, but he never moved from the spot that they stood. The boy just stared at me while he held the reins. In fact, he didn't blink a single time. He just stared at me, face completely emotionless. I don't remember the moving either, but it was only seconds, but remember being completely frozen when I saw him, too scared to scream. Then I think my fight or flight kicked in because I bolted home and almost broke the door, throwing myself inside. The weirdest thing, though, was when I looked back, they were gone, like they had just disappeared into thin air. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me, and fast forward 10-ish years, something interesting happens. Same property, and my mum is running a daycare out of it at this time, and the boy and his horse is just something fun that I tell my friends when they first come over at this point. This time it was daylight, and in the morning. A kid was getting dropped off by their parent, and all of a sudden they point to that spot, and they say, "Look, Mummy, a horsey." I didn't see anything when I looked, but my mum said that I went super pale, and I was pretty freaked out. But I also was kind of excited that somebody else had potentially seen the same thing I did. I'm glad it was less traumatic for that kid, though. I had some experiences in that house as well, but I'm almost 100% certain that they were the result of sleep paralysis. The only one that I'm not certain on is one where I watched indentations move around the carpet in my childhood room like someone was walking. But I was also in bed, so still, it could have been sleep paralysis, I admit. I have gone to visit the property since then. My grandma still lives next door, but I haven't seen or heard anything about the boy and his horse since the daycare kids saw them. It still blows my mind just how vividly I can picture that night. I recently went on vacation with my parents to a resort, and one night, my dad went to bed early while my mum and I sat outside and talked. She is a very reserved woman who keeps many things to herself and likes small talk, so this caught me completely off guard. She was looking up at the sky and seemed like she was thinking hard about something. She suddenly asks me, in Spanish, "Do you remember Cousin Jorge? You met him when you were little, but he died not long after." I did remember him, a little anyway. I remember going to Cuba with my parents to visit family, and I met my cousin there. I was about 8, I think, and he was very sweet and welcoming, about my dad's age. He asked me so many questions about life in the US, and played games with me. After a while, he went over to the adults, and suddenly he became sort of hysterical, crying and hyperventilating, yelling things that I couldn't understand at the time. It scared me, so I remember hiding, but that was really all that I remember of him. My mum proceeded to tell me what she remembers of him. This took place in Havana, where they're from. My mum said he was a completely normal person. We used to spend a lot of time together because he lived next door. He was about 10 years older than me, but he took me everywhere, running errands, hanging out with his friends. He helped people with housework and with livestock. There was never anything odd about him. Everyone loved him. Then, when I was about 7 or 8, he was 17 or 18, he had to do his mandatory military service, as every male did in Cuba. At first, he wrote me letters, but after a few months, those stopped. He would only write to his mother, and I overheard her talking to my mum and grandma Hilda about how something about his letters just didn't seem right. And then the letters stopped altogether. One day, I was at my aunt's, Jorge's mum's, and there is a knock at our door. I answered it, and there were 2 men in military uniforms. My aunt and my grandma hurried towards the door and told me to go away. I hid behind the hallway wall and listened. I couldn't hear everything, but the men said that Cousin Jorge was unwell and he was being sent back home. A couple of weeks later, sure enough, Cousin Jorge gets sent back, escorted by another young soldier who was his friend. Grandma later told me that his friend had quietly let them know that Cousin Jorge had apparently been in a submarine with the Russians, no idea where, and that while he was down there, he saw something and immediately went haywire. After that, he was very different. Like, he'd be acting completely normally, and then randomly go into hysterics, screaming nonsense, crying, throwing things. He also refused to talk about his military service. One day, when I was 16, someone in the neighborhood gave me my first Bible. I was really excited to receive it too. We didn't have much of anything, so being given a Bible as a gift was really exciting. I came home with it, and Cousin Jorge was there. He saw it and stared at it in my hands for a moment. He then stood up and walked over to me, grabbed the Bible from my hands, and flipped to the first chapter. He then said, "Genesis, the first great lie." The way that he said it terrified me, though, and I grabbed the Bible back in case he'd try to destroy it. He didn't follow me when I left, but I could hear him having another meltdown after this. Cousin Jorge, he never recovered. He ended up becoming extremely religious later in life, but still had frequent episodes and delusions. He passed in the early 2010s from a heart attack, unfortunately. My mum adored him, and I know that hurt her badly to see him suddenly change like that. I could see the pain in her eyes as she told me all of this, staring off into the night sky as she spoke. I have a couple of theories, though, about what may have happened. One, he may have been subjected to psychological experiments at the hands of the Cubans or Russian military that led him to lose his mind. Two, he may have developed a mental illness later in life. I remember reading that schizophrenia often comes around in males in their early 20s. The stress of military service, maybe that could have triggered an underlying mental illness. Or three, he really did see something that made him snap. But what could it have been? If anyone else has any theories, then genuinely, I would love to hear them. I'm a registered nurse, and in my career of floor nursing, I have many stories, as I'm sure that many nurses do. But one that always comes to mind is this. It was an older woman that, at the end of the shift, interrupted me while I was checking in on her. As she raised her shaky hand pointing in my direction, she said, "Could you please tell him to leave?" I turned around, just the empty corner of the room behind me, and said, "Who?" Dead serious, she repeated, "Him. Tell him to leave. I don't like him." I thought that this was strange, as she wasn't a psych patient, no history of hallucinations or anything. So I replied, "Ma'am, there's no one there. It's just you and I in the room." She kept staring in the corner. "No, there's a man in the corner wearing a dark hood. Tell him to leave." Well, I finished my shift pretty much then and there, and I went home. I came back the next week, and that patient was no longer in that room. After inquiring from co-workers, I found out that she had passed away 2 days after the night that she told me about the man in the hood in her room. And for whatever reason, I still get chills when I think about it. As I've been listening to some of the stories here, I remembered this night from about 8 years ago. It was after 11 p.m. and I was taking my dogs out for their last toileting walk before bed. At the time, I was living in a rural area, houses farther apart, lots of wooded area, and lots around with wild pigs often crossing our path. I would often take long walks because one of the dogs had a problem with having accidents in the morning if he hadn't had an adequate walk to do all of his business. It was dark, so I had the flashlight and really wasn't expecting to meet anyone. I mean, especially in the middle of nowhere, so late at night, but there appeared on the opposite side of the road ahead was another flashlight. We had few neighbors, but of the homes around, I knew most of all of them from the years. On rare occasion, somebody else may be walking a dog, but I could count the instances on my fingers. As I passed the other flashlight in the night, a tall, thin, pale man, who I had never seen before, crossed the street to my side and began to follow behind me. He yelled out, "Hey, I like your dogs, can I pet them?" I stayed calm, walking briskly, ignoring him. My house was close and I was almost home at the end of the walk. He continued to follow, yelling, "Hey, what's your name? I just want to pet your dogs." He had a thick European or Slavic accent. I ignored him and ran up into my house through the door, locked it, and ran into my bedroom. I told my husband that there was a strange man who followed me home, and that I was super disturbed that he knows where I live now. My brave husband immediately ran out of the house, I guess to find this guy. I was on pins and needles waiting for him to come back. He came back home with his steel baseball bat in hand. He said that he caught up to him and asked who the heck he was, and why he was following around a woman at basically midnight being a creep. The guy said that he was new in town, and he was walking around hoping to meet or make some new friends. Basically, his story was bizarre and totally didn't make any sense. My husband, he told me that if he ever sees him again near our home, he was going to break his knees with the baseball bat. But after that, I never saw him again. Until 2 years later, in a neighboring city. I was out with a girlfriend, looking at art in a museum when I turned the corner and suddenly it was him. I would never forget his face. He looked straight at me and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he knew who I was from that night. Something like, "Oh, you're the girl from that night with the dogs." I don't remember because I was just sort of in disbelief, but again, with the thick European accent, tall, skinny, pale, I grabbed my friend's arm and quickly walked in the opposite direction. She asked me, "Do you know that creepy guy?" And I told her the story as we left the museum. Thankfully, after that, I never did see him again. What are the odds, though, of this being a coincidence? Pretty unlikely, right? The first time I ever played with a Ouija board was when I was about 11. It was me and two of my friends. Their names were Katie and Taylor. Katie's older sister, Lauren, and her friend, Sam, had us come upstairs. Lauren and Sam had a talking board. Basically, it was a super girly looking Ouija board with a kitty on it. But Katie, Taylor, and I laughed but said, "Okay, sure." We all put our fingers on the piece and it pretty quickly started moving across the board. And it spelled out, "Run." My friends and I freaked out and yanked our hands back. Lauren and Sam busted out laughing. They said that they had moved it to just scare us. Katie started yelling at them as they continued to laugh at us, but it was about that time the bathroom light turned off. It made us all jump as it was the only light that we had on, and then it turned back on. Taylor spoke up and said, "Okay, you got us, we're done." But Lauren and Sam seemed genuinely spooked at this point. And then the planchette started to move towards me on its own. At this point, Katie, Taylor, Lauren, and Sam are all standing together opposite me. I say, "Haha, very funny. I saw that coming from a mile away." But when I looked at Lauren and Sam, all I saw was pure fear. They had no color in their faces and were just sort of staring at the planchette, wide-eyed. Sam finally spoke up in a very shaky voice and said, "No, that's not us." And then Lauren very calmly said, "Guys, go now." We all took off downstairs and out the front door. Taylor and Katie started yelling again, saying, "If that was you guys, cut it out and tell us the truth." But by now, Lauren and Sam were on the verge of tears and hyperventilating. That was when I glanced up to the bedroom window. I saw the light in the bathroom turn off, and then that's when I saw a small black figure about my size sprint past the window. Nobody else was in the house, though. Lauren and Katie's older brothers were off both at college, and their dad was still at work, and their mum had to run to the store and wasn't back yet. Katie and Taylor, they slept over at my house that night, and Lauren slept over with Sam. We never spoke about that experience to each other ever again after that. But it wasn't long after that incident that Katie, Taylor, and we had a big falling out. I haven't seen or spoken to Taylor since. It's been about 18 years. Katie and I reconnected a few years ago on Instagram and chat every now and then, but we still never talk about that night. In 2018, I moved into a small 2-story property in England with my then boyfriend. It was in a quiet cul-de-sac, with houses literally crammed together, all facing each other. I am very introverted and I don't typically make a habit of socializing much with neighbors. Still, we naturally ran into a few and exchanged pleasantries when we had to, as you would, right? Now, one of our new neighbors, Greg, was incredibly welcoming right off the bat. He was an older gentleman, the kind that who would stop for a chat that would drag on and on until you made up an excuse for why you really had to get going. He shared local stories, asked about and took note of our birthdays, and even invited us around for a garden party where any and all were welcome. His house was directly across the street from where I lived, with his windows in clear view of mine. A couple of years passed by, and during this time, my boyfriend and I split up. Although I never expressly shared this news with my neighbors, word must have gotten around with his car missing from the driveway. He moved out and left the country in the end, but we stayed in touch regularly as friends. Having the house to myself felt, well, lonely, so I got a cat to keep me company. He quickly became, and still is, my world. Greg would often flag me down to talk when he caught me leaving or returning to my house. Annoying, but I could live with it, I suppose. I'd update my ex about weird little interactions with Greg, which we both found amusing to gossip about. But one such incident was when Greg came to my door to hand over 2 of my parcels, one of which was a large table that he had yet to retrieve from his house. I had been raiding in Elder Scroll Online at the time, doing a deathless speedrun for an achievement. Given the time constraint in my game, I told him that I'd leave the door unlocked so that he could simply put it by my door. I sat back down at my desk, put my headset on, and my group charged in at the final boss. I heard my front door opening, followed by the sound of my large parcel being placed down. But then, footsteps approached me from behind. I peered behind me to see Greg standing there, eyes sort of fixed on me. For fear of disappointing my raid group, I continued playing until we killed the boss, and then took off my headset. Greg's face lit up, and he went on to tell me how amazing it was to watch me play. I got the impression that he'd never seen someone use a keyboard, let alone play games. He begged me to teach him and rambled on. He was clearly intoxicated, so I laughed it off and gave a non-committal response. Despite repeated attempts to politely make him leave, he could not be persuaded. He seemed disappointed when I walked over to my door and opened it to clearly signal that it was time to go, but he left without further incident. In the UK, houses often have individual outdoor bins for trash, which have to be rolled out to the street the night before collections take place. You're expected to bring the bins back to your property after collection, and I noticed someone kept bringing my bins back in for me. Was I blocking someone's car by being too slow to do it? Around the same time, I also noticed someone had been using my bins. I brought it up to Greg one time. He pulled me over to talk, and he said the same thing had been happening to him. Maybe it was petty of me, but I decided to tape an old phone with a surveillance app to my window, overlooking the bins to figure out who it was. And lo and behold, it was Greg. I chalked it up to him having run out of bin space after the local council moved from weekly to bi-weekly collections due to staffing issues. And although it bothered me, my desire to avoid confrontation won in the end. Christmas rolled around, and the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing at this point. But one late evening, I heard a knock at my door and walked over to see who it was. I had no peephole, so I opened the door not knowing what to expect. Greg stood at my doorstep, which was not particularly unusual. I'd gotten all too used to his antics. But I immediately caught a strong waft of alcohol. He spoke before I had time to process. He told me that he had a Christmas present for me and handed over a red gift bag with colored tissue paper covering the contents. I really want to give you a kiss on the cheek, but I can't, not with this pandemic going around, he said. That gave me the heebie-jeebies, so I did all I could to politely end this interaction and retreat back inside. He held me up by rambling on about, well, who knows what, to be honest, but I firmly told him that I was busy and I needed to go. That's when he laid a hand on my shoulder, leaned in, kissed my cheek, and then walked off in the direction of his house. I closed the door and simply stood there for a few moments in shock. The present was odd, too. Underneath the tissue paper were 2 bottles of Belgian beer, a can of half-eaten Pringles, sour cream and onion, and a small plastic bag containing little chocolates. I also recognized the latter item. A next-door neighbor with young children had come around to put these plastic bags with chocolate and a handwritten note, signed with their address, through everyone's mail slots a few weeks prior. It was a sweet gesture and probably something they came up with to keep the stir-crazy kids busy, but upon inspecting the re-gifted chocolates, I noticed that he'd even forgotten to remove the note from the neighbor. This kiss and gift, it definitely gave me bad vibes, and I regretted accepting it. It was at this point too that I decided that I was done being Miss Polite and resolved to be firm in my future rejections. Now, on the second day of the new year, I was feeling lazy and ordered food delivery. A mere 5 minutes after receiving my order, there was a knock at my door. Knowing that the delivery driver hadn't forgotten anything, I concluded that this had to be Greg. And then it clicked for me. He'd often turn up immediately after anything was delivered to my door, which meant that he was constantly watching my house. Was he dumping trash in my bins as an excuse to hang around my house? He called out for me through the door. I felt too uncomfortable to answer, and I retreated upstairs out of view from the windows. Later that night, he came back and kept knocking too, but once again I ignored it in hopes of him going away. The following day, I contacted the police to file a harassment report. I felt sheepish doing so. I mean, was it really that bad? He was just a lonely old man, and I hadn't been firm enough, probably. Upon being asked whether I wanted the police to speak with him, I told them that I'd do it myself. I just wanted the report on file in case anything else actually happened. I would later become grateful for filing this report, by the way. Greg turned up at my door a few days later, telling me how worried he was about me. I told him, verbatim, I think it's best if we don't have any contact going forward. His response was eerie. I just wanted to be your friend. I held my ground, cut the conversation short, and closed the door. Finally, it's over, I thought. And a year went by without incident. Everything seemed fine, with no knocks on the door or unwanted conversations while I was outside. One night in winter, I was leaving my house to get groceries. It was completely dark outside, save for a lamppost casting some sparse light into the street. My driveway was at the side of my house, where the bins were stored. This driveway was blocked in by a tall panel fence to add some privacy, seeing as the kitchen window was directly next to it. You could see right into my kitchen and living room through this window. As I was outside locking the door, that was when I saw a figure in the dark, slinking out of my driveway and behind the fence. I immediately unlocked the door and went back inside. It was dark. I could have imagined it, but my gut told me otherwise. Was there someone waiting for me behind the fence? Ultimately, I trusted my instincts and decided to forego the groceries for the night. I bought and mounted a motion sensor light to illuminate my driveway too. The memory of the shadowy figure quickly faded in my mind, and the new light gave me some comfort that I'd at least be alerted if someone was lurking outside of my window. A couple of months after the incident, I was in my kitchen getting some food for my beloved cat. The window was directly to my left, around 3 feet away from where I stood. As I dumped the cat food into a bowl, I suddenly became aware of my motion sensor light being on. I scanned the outside, not seeing anything, until my eye landed on something in the bottom corner of the window. I squinted, trying to make out what I was looking at. It somehow wasn't properly illuminated. I kept staring for what must have been 30 seconds. The light outside remained on. And suddenly, Greg pops up into view, directly outside. He'd been crouched down, peering in from the corner of the window. I'm normally someone who's as cool as a cucumber. I never raise my voice or yell, but I truly lost it at that moment, screaming, "What are you doing?" repeatedly. He just stood there, and then nonchalantly asked, "Are you all right?" I kept screaming, but now it was, "Why are you there?" Then he just turned around and walked off into the dark. I immediately called the police. Typically, the police in England leave something to be desired, but I have to give them credit for how they handled this situation. They took my statement over the phone and gave me a reference number. I received a couple of phone calls with updates and was told that they'd bring him to the station. I was also informed that he was known to the police for having previously followed young women. Sometime later, he was arrested at his property in front of a wife that I didn't even know existed. They did this to scare him, according to the officer that I spoke to make a bit of a point. Sadly, he received nothing more than a police caution, which forbade him from being on my side of the cul-de-sac or contacting me. Still, it seemed to work. The window incident was the last real interaction that I ever had with Greg. I did see him staring at me in the shower from his window one time when I forgot to close the blinds, but other than that, really there was nothing else. Thankfully too, I have since moved far away from Greg, which I am very, very grateful for. I was between 3 and 5 years old, so it was around 1989 to 1991. My room was on the complete opposite end of the house from my parents' bedroom, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night on a regular basis, scared. When I'd wake up, I remember seeing this woman standing at the end of my bed. I could kind of see through her, but she also put off a glow. It was a warm, loving, welcoming, and peaceful glow. She was also wearing a blue tunic and a white headdress. She was always looking down, holding and happily comforting a baby wrapped in a blanket. After a few seconds of having my eyes open, she'd always notice that I was awake and would act surprised, like I wasn't supposed to see her. Then she'd immediately disappear. I never felt threatened by her. I remember the first time that I saw her, I really didn't know what to think, and I pulled my sheets over my head before she disappeared. She really did give off an aura that was comforting, welcoming. The glow coming off of her felt like that, like I knew that I was completely safe while sleeping. This happened quite a few times too, to the point that I'd smile when I saw her after waking up, and she'd look back with a smile that was comforting, yet at the same time also conveyed something like, "You aren't actually supposed to be seeing me," while still intentionally letting me see her for a few seconds before fading away. She felt like a very, familiar mother figure, but it wasn't my mother. I was always scared right after she disappeared though, because that safe feeling would disappear as well, and I'd want to run to my parents' bedroom. I could see my parents' bedroom from the doorway of my room, but you had to walk through the dining room and living room to get to it. But there were also always these strange shadowy figures, dozens of them walking around in the dining room, kitchen and living room. I remember being very scared of them, but I never actually drew their attention while I stood there, watching them from my bedroom doorway, and they never really seemed to notice me or walk toward me too. It seemed that they were always in a hurry though, walking with busy intent but never actually going anywhere. I was always scared of them, even more scared that I'd actually draw their attention, but I wanted the comfort of my parents. I was too scared to run through the shadow people that were walking around, so I'd always scream for my parents from my bedroom doorway. The instant that I would scream, the shadow people would stop walking. Then all of them would look up at me with an angry and frustrated aura, but never actually took a step towards me. They'd just disappear about the time that I'd hear either of my parents' voices as my mum or dad walked toward me. One of the last times that I saw the lady at the end of my bed and the shadow people, I wanted to get to my parents' room where they were, but instead of just calling out for them, I just closed my eyes and held out my hands to feel my way across the dining room and living room to my parents' bedroom. I actually made it there on my own. Even with my eyes closed, I could feel them there before they started to disappear, but I could also feel as they were fading away that they were angry because I wasn't as scared of them anymore. I stopped seeing them shortly after that, which was also around the time that I started feeling more comfortable staying in my own bed all night by myself without needing to have my parents close by. But it's one of the most real and vivid memories that I can remember from when I was that age. I'm 38 now, and I still remember exactly what the lady looked like and felt like, and the shadow people too. This wasn't even an old house or anything, though, that you'd really associate with a stereotypical haunted place. It was actually a relatively new double-wide trailer that my mum and dad had put there a few years before I was born. They bought the trailer brand new directly from the manufacturer, and I feel like what I saw and felt had to be real, though, because a 3 to 5-year-old wouldn't have been able to imagine that physical feeling from her aura that was so welcoming. It was a distinct physical feeling that a 3 to 5-year-old wouldn't have been able to just randomly imagine, a feeling that I still somehow remember. I never did see anything like that again in that place, or any other place that I've lived. I haven't experienced anything paranormal since, and I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I work at a condo complex by the beach. I've been here for about 3 years, and my co-workers, who have been here for 10 plus years, always talk about seeing and hearing spooky stuff. To give you some background, I'm a skeptical believer. In the past 3 years, I've never had anything happen that I couldn't debunk. Until tonight, that is. I have a radio that I carry with me when there are 2 of us working. Normally, I'm here by myself, so I don't usually have it on me, but this night I did. While waiting in the lobby of the 2nd floor for the elevator, the radio suddenly kicked on, like someone was trying to talk. I took it out of my pocket and heard a faint little girl's voice saying, "Can you see me?" twice, followed by, "I'm right behind you." My initial thought was that my co-workers were playing a joke on me, so I just put the radio back in my pocket. When I got back to the guard shack, I told my co-worker that it was a funny prank. He looked at me though, and he's not the type to lie, and said that he had no clue what I was talking about. So apparently I had my first paranormal experience. I spoke to my boss this morning too and told him what happened. He wasn't surprised as well, and said it normally happens on the 6th floor. He mentioned that he has seen and heard 2 little kids running up and down the hallways, and that they have messed with the radio before. He asked around, but no one knows anything about any kids passing away here. However, this building has been here since 1974, and was one of the first condos built in this area. This is more of my dad's story than mine, but I still think that it's good to share it. In August of '06, my family was stationed at Fort Riley in Kansas. We moved into this gorgeous duplex at the end of a horseshoe-shaped neighborhood. The house was built in the early 1900s and had an unfinished basement with these pool lights that only light up this small area around you. In the basement, there were also these really small boot prints in the cement that looked as if they belonged to a child. The house had a grand staircase that only went to and from the ground floor to the 2nd floor, and a back staircase which went to all 4 floors, originally intended for servants. The ground floor held main living areas, and my brother and I were on the 2nd. I snagged the master, which had its own doorbell. For a 6-year-old, this was awesome, but probably obnoxious. My parents, they stayed on the top floor, which had an unfinished attic room that held pieces of original furniture. Our babysitter once joked that vampires lived in there. Anyway, about a month after moving in, a woman knocked on the door and introduced herself as part of the Historical Society, and asked for my family's permission for this home to be featured in the annual Halloween ghost tour, informing us that this is a usual stop. She let us know that this home was host to a spirit called the Buckskin Ghost, as he appears as a man in buckskin clothing. We informed her that we were new and hadn't had any paranormal experiences. She asked how long we'd been here for. My dad said about a month, to which she replies, "Oh, usually he shows himself by now." My dad politely declined to be on the tour. I think my parents either didn't believe or were a little bit scared, but we were still unpacking things at this point too, mostly boxes which were in the garage, which was attached to the back stairwell near the basement. Now, Dad noticed the light in the garage was out and went to go and change it. Completely normal thing. As my dad is reaching up to change the light, it comes back on though. He makes sure that it's screwed in all the way, climbs down the ladder and puts it away. When he returns to the garage, the light is out. Confused, my dad fetched the ladder again. He returns. The light's back on though. Frustrated, he moves the ladder out of the way. The light goes off. So he sets up the ladder, climbs up, and as he's reaching up to change the light, it comes back on again. My dad is beyond frustrated now and yells, "Stop messing with me." The light comes back on and doesn't go out the entire time that we live there. This was our introduction to the next 10 months. Other odd things happened in the home, like the radio turning on to a static station extremely loudly, and there were rooms in the basement our dog just would never go in. Anytime anything would happen, we would refer to Bucky acting up. While we lived there, we learned more about the base's haunted history too. We even purchased a book of the ghost stories, which included our home. This book also featured a story of a little girl who befriended a ghost who would play dolls with them. When that family moved out, the girl left her doll at the house for her friend. Now, remember the original furniture that was in the attic? When we first moved in, we looked in all the drawers, and in one of those drawers, there was that doll. One that I didn't learn anything about until months later. I don't know what happened to the doll, but I only ever saw it once. For the most part, nothing too terrifying happened in the house, up until my dad stayed by himself. My dad was a night pilot, meaning that he usually slept during the day, and one day he was woken up by the sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs at the base level. My dad got up and opened the door and asked if anyone was there, and immediately the noise stops. My dad went to check the window overlooking the street to see if a service van was at the house or something. For those who haven't lived on a military base, they occasionally send people to the home to do things like change air filters and all that. My dad didn't see anything though, and so he went back to bed. But he was awoken again to the sound of heavy footsteps on what he perceived as the second floor. My dad shot out of bed, went to the door, and as soon as he opened the door, the noises, they stopped. He yells again, "Is anyone there?" No response. So he goes and he lays back down. My dad then hears items of furniture moving in the room opposite the wall in front of the bed, the one with the original furniture items. He jumps out of bed and leaves the house without a second thought at this point, and it wasn't until he was at work later that he realized that he would be going back to the home alone, and questioned what was in that home with him. I was 6 when all of this went down, and for years we have talked about these experiences and others that have happened to their friends and family. We've continued to check for more stories online about this house. Others have also experienced a friendly but mischievous ghost affectionately called Bucky. I've had other strange experiences throughout my life, and I believe this house is what opened me up to them. I'm now dating a man who is very much a skeptic, and while visiting my home in Florida, my dad told him this story. Weirdly too, the light in the kitchen was flickering throughout this retelling. Jokingly, my boyfriend yells, "Stop messing with me," when it flickers off. The light immediately then turned on and continued to stay on while he visited. You can look up the ghost of 85B Schofield Circle, Fort Riley, Kansas if you would like to. There are plenty of stories from the base that deserve to be heard, including this one, and I encourage those who have made it this far to do some additional research on this haunted military base. And if you live in this house, please let Bucky's story be told on that ghost tour. This happened to me when I was about 21 years old. So my friends and I went into a local cemetery one night to check out the train grave, which was the grave of a man who died in the 1960s while working on a train. There is a piece of a train on his grave marker, a coupler I think. That is what it looks like anyway. And we walked over to it, heard a train whistle from the tracks a quarter mile or so away, and got a little bit spooked, but we weren't spooked enough to actually leave. It was just sort of coincidental, I suppose. So, we're all wandering around, and my grandfather happens to be buried in this cemetery too. Where the road split, they all wanted to go to the right, but I knew that my grandpa's grave was to the left. I told everyone that I would catch up with them in a minute. I just wanted to check if he still had flowers on his grave, and if not, I'd go and pick some up the next day. There's a small evergreen tree beside my grandpa's grave, roughly 7 feet tall, or maybe a little bit taller. And as I walked up to where I knew that he was buried, I suddenly became very confused, because there were 2 trees there. I stopped walking about 75 yards from the grave itself, trying to figure out when they planted a second tree. When the second tree took a step forward toward me. At that, I booked it and ran back the way that I came, convinced the whole time that something was about to grab me from behind. My friends, they got to the car shortly after me, and I told them about what happened, and they said that they noped out because one of them saw a deer that looked solid black. What I had seen had to have been at least the height of the other tree though, and looked plenty tree-like, up until it took that step forward. It was super dark, so I didn't get the best look at it, but whatever it was, I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I went back in the daytime the next day with some flowers, and I can confirm that there was only one tree by my grandpa's grave. This story is actually my grandfather's, and after he told it to me, it's always stuck with me. He liked traveling when he was in his 20s with his friends, and happened to work in Saudi Arabia at that time. He was on his way from Jordan to Saudi Arabia by car with one of his best friends. Now, if you don't know, going from an Arab country to another in a car is a pretty common way that people traveled back in the days, 1970s and 80s. They started their journey at 12 p.m. and they first entered the Saudi lands at 6 p.m. or something, which, by the way, at that time and still today, is a fully deserted road. All you see around you is sand. But nowadays, it's more merciful, so there are some buildings and all that, just to keep people safe along the way. Anyway, for context, it takes about 30 plus hours to travel from Jordan to Saudi Arabia, specifically a city called Dammam that is far to the east of the country. And here is where it gets real interesting. It was after sunset. My grandpa and his friend, they both wanted to stop and take some rest, possibly sleep. And back in those days, there used to be these sort of rooms, like literally just a room in the middle of the desert for travelers to use for sleep and rest. And that's exactly what my grandpa and his friend did. Now, this room had no door, no furniture or anything. Literally, it was just an empty room with a dune probably surrounding it from all sides. It was maybe about 7 p.m. at the time that they stopped the car and set their stuff out, and they were making tea, only to hear this hissing voice of a woman coming from one of the dunes. So, apparently they had the courage to go out and check it out. They walked into the sand until they were beside this dune, and yes, a woman was there. As what my grandpa described, she wore a black dress that fully covered her body, and her hair was really messy and had red, brown, and orange streaks. Her back was to them, and by literal words she said, "Get out of here, it's not your place." Now, this was weird enough, but it doesn't end here, because my grandpa wanted to mess around apparently, and he asked for her name, and she answered with Beduria, or something like that. I'm bad with names, so I can't remember exactly, so you'll have to excuse me, but she also introduced herself as a member of Jinn. Now, if you don't know anything about the term Jinn, basically that means demon. And at this, of course, my grandpa and his friend, they took that as a sign to immediately leave. So they left, but when they turned around, this woman was just gone. They gathered their belongings quickly back into the car, and they drove until dawn. I'm from Southeast Asia, and a little more than 15 years ago, when I was about 7, I lived at my very first house, which eventually became haunted by not just one, but many paranormal entities. You could say a mass haunting, I suppose. It was an apartment-type house. My mother and father hadn't gotten divorced yet. My dad had a friend who was a druggie and would come over to either play video games with my dad or just have a safe place to use. We were all close to him, and he was a nice guy, actually. It was pretty sad that he was using, to be honest. One night, though, he came banging on our front door, and he looked really freaked out. Apparently, he went deep into a forest nearby our house to use, and he said that while he was using, he saw a Pontianak. A little info about this entity. Long hair-covered face, white-clothed. If you hear her far away, it means that she's near. If you hear her near, it means that she's actually far away, which is a tactic to lure people. Some people either hear her hum a song, cry, sounds exactly like the witch in Left 4 Dead by the way, or laugh in a super high-pitched voice, which kind of sounds like a bird, except that no bird in the world sounds like that. She also floats or sort of flies instead of walking. Anyway, while my dad's friend was using in the forest, apparently he saw the entity and it chased him. Stupidly, our house was the first place that he ran to. My parents opened the door and they let him in. Obviously at the time, they didn't know whether this was just some sort of drug-induced hallucination or what, but they took him in anyway and they helped him out. But a few days later, creepy things started to happen at my apartment level. Our windows were opaque, and some nights we would see a tall woman with long hair and white clothes pass by the window without any footsteps heard. And honestly, it looked more like she was floating past. One of the neighbors had a dog, and some nights in the AMs would bark furiously. The neighbor said that she saw it standing in her house too while her dog was barking at it, and it did nothing but stand there. My other neighbors saw it in their houses too, and it seemed like this thing would just sort of roam about. Now one morning at 6 a.m, I was waiting for my mum to get ready to send me to school, so I sat at the living room sofa, TV was in front and dining table was at my back, and I saw it in the reflection of my TV. Long black hair, white clothed, sitting at the dining table area. I looked back to see, and all the dining table chairs were empty. I kept looking at the reflection in the dining area back and forth, but nothing was making any sense, to which I slowly realized what it was, and I took a pillow cover to my face and ears while lying down on the sofa. About half an hour or so goes by, and my mother woke me up, and when I looked at the TV reflection, the entity was gone. My life was terrible back then, having a violent and physically abusive dad, so things weren't smooth at all. And what made things worse with the hauntings was when my dad did black magic rituals, he would draw these diagrams like those in the occult, using his blood and cigarette ashes. He would turn every religious display on the wall upside down in the house when he did the ritual. All of this was done when me and my mum weren't in the house. But after all of that, things got way worse. Shadow people started showing up at night. Some nights my mum would be woken up by me trying to help me switch on the toilet light, as I'm small and couldn't reach the switch. I would always wake her up in the night to help me with this. And one night, she would be woken up by me to help switch on the toilet light. And as she was waiting, she called for me, but there was no response. And the plot twist was that I was actually asleep in my room, and it wasn't me that woke her up to go to the toilet. One night too, my dad invited his other friend over to stay the night. I decided to sleep in the hall with his friend named Gary. Gary started hearing someone whisper calling his name from the front door. Weirdly, I couldn't hear anything at all, and it just apparently kept going on and on until it freaked him out so much that he left the house. It was the last time that he came to our house too, but the next paranormal activity was when our toilet taps would turn on. But as soon as any one of us would walk towards the toilet, it would stop. Our toilet flush would go off on its own too, and I would hear like these mass whispers in the middle of the night, but couldn't make out what the whispers were saying. I would also hear like buzzing sounds when this happens, and no, I was not asleep or sleep paralysis at all. I was wide awake and moving freely. If you've ever seen the video of the YouTuber exploring an abandoned mine in the night to review a flashlight and hearing whispers, that's exactly what it sounded like. Another night, my dad got the worst out of us all. This shadow entity started climbing on top of him and choking him, two to be exact, one on top of him and another standing at the side of him, both with glowing red eyes. My dad was certainly a no-nonsense sort of guy, and he wouldn't lie about something like this. I've seen other weird things like a white silhouette of a boy standing directly in front of me for a good 2 seconds before slowly disappearing into thin air. I've seen a shadow dart past the room, and the hauntings, they didn't stop at all, even after my parents' divorce. Me and my mum, we went to stay at her brother's place while she rented out our home to foreigners for about 2 to 3 years solid. The tenants, they had not seen or heard any weird things in the house while we were gone, so we assumed that the haunting was over. Well, the entity with the black long hair and white clothes, it was gone, but the demonic entity that my father brought from his rituals, they were definitely still there tormenting the place when me and my mum moved back in. We would still see shadow entities dart past the halls, but really there was nothing more than that. Eventually, my mum sold the house a long time ago, and since then, thankfully, nothing else has happened. So I would love some insight as to what might be going on here. I have a client, her name is Kat. I was assigned her as a patient a month ago, and I love working with Kat. She's 78 and has dementia. And one day, I went down to the basement, as that's where the laundry room is, to do some laundry. As I was loading them, Kat came and silently stood behind me with a blank stare. When I turned around, I was a little bit frightened, but just led her back to her chair upstairs where she normally sits. I have no idea how she got down there, to be honest though, and the stairs usually creak, so I'm not sure why I didn't hear it. Stairs are right above the washer and the dryer. Anyway, moving forward with my day, I go to switch the laundry, and as I'm doing that, I hear the stairs start to creak, so I go to lead Kat back to her chair, and she just wasn't there. I came up and I saw her sitting there watching the TV. I don't think too much of it and go to continue what I was doing with no problems. And it was around this time that my stomach started hurting while switching laundry, so I quickly went to the restroom. It's in the same room as the laundry. And when I came out, the lights were off. And I could also see someone in the hanging clothes area, so I kind of panicked and turned the lights on, but when I did, no one was there. I went back upstairs, and Kat was in the chair, so I just sort of sat down next to her, contemplating what had just happened. A few shifts go by and I don't encounter anything too alarming until the middle of this shift that I needed to use the restroom, so I went to the one upstairs. There's no restrooms on the main floor level, just the kitchen, dining room and living room, because I was slightly nervous about going to the basement one. I shut the door behind me and I heard a deep whisper. I don't know what it said and it really scared me. I instantly turned around to go out though and slipped on the rug and bonked my head. I really wanted to brush it off though, since I needed to be helping my patient and not be on some crazy ghost thing, but I was really spooked by it. And so now I hurry to complete my tasks if they're anywhere beside the main level. A little bit of context to this third one. As I mentioned earlier, Kat has dementia and requests for me to leave at least 6 to 10 times a day. However, on one of these days, she didn't do that and instead requested Vanessa to leave. I don't know a Vanessa. There was nobody else there and nobody else was home, so I just reassured her that it was just me and her. She did not want me to leave her side that day though, so I tried my best to be with her the whole time while completing tasks, but she seemed really panicked. I tried not to let it get the best of me, and that could just be her having dementia, but I don't know. All of it together just really, really freaks me out. This is not my story, but it actually happened to a friend. He's a metalhead and hangs out mostly with his kind. And when he was in junior high, him and his group of friends thought that it would be funny to do a session, a Ouija board session that is. At first, the answers were kind of random. No one was truly convinced that it was working. One of these guys had a friend, my classmate, who was about to participate in Taekwondo tournaments. He was the only one out of the group who knew the name of his friend's rival. He asked what the rival was called, and the board gave a different name. He said, "That's not her," and they took it even less seriously. Then they asked what the entity's name was. My friend doesn't remember the exact answer, but he says it sounded like how you'd expect a demon to be called, something creepy. That happened on a weekend, and after that they ended it. On Monday, though, they went back to school and told their classmate, the one who participated in the tournament, that the Ouija board had given them a wrong name. They said this jokingly, but the classmate told them that the fight was cancelled last minute and wrote on the board the name of her new rival, which coincided with what the board had told them except for one letter. It was a very, very unusual name, one that nobody could have known at the time of the session. They were obviously very shocked by this, but it didn't stop there. It was around this time too that my friend recalls that they all went through some weeks of bad luck. Silly things would happen to all of them, like a black car almost running over one of them in a parking lot and stuff. They naturally didn't tell their families what they had done, but the worst thing happened to the sister of one of them. One evening, he was on his computer, which was under a staircase. His sister was watching TV facing him and the stairs, and this is how he tells it. His sister saw a couple of goat legs slowly walking down the stairs. The roof was blocking the entire view, so she thought maybe her mum was wearing a costume or something. But when the legs reached a certain step, she could see how they lacked an upper body. It was just a pair of black goat-like legs. She screamed and had an anxiety attack, couldn't stop crying. The brother says that he didn't see anything since he was focused on the computer. I personally think that it is not a good idea to use a Ouija board, just to see if the stories are real especially. After hearing this from my friend, I have huge respect for the board, and this regardless of those who have done it without anything happening to them.